Chapter 950. The Demon Slayer's spear had exploded. The explosion produced a huge positive energy wave that spread out from the valley like a supernova explosion. This positive energy wave was like a super large area of effect healing. Although it did not cause any damage, it shocked everyone on the scene. Modesty, who was in mid-air, was stunned for a moment before she realized what had happened. She laughed shrilly in the air. "Ha, you damn idiots, what can you rely on now? Enjoy the taste of despair." With a high-pitched laugh, the dragon spread her wings and swooped down from the sky. Brando only heard a sonic boom coming from above his head. He could not help but feel his scalp tingle. He did not even have time to look up at Modesty's position because he only had a moment to react. He had to judge the direction of the dragon's dive through the sound. His past experience seemed to have sharpened his senses 1,000 times. It was not that he had not fought against a dragon before. It was just that it was not in this world. Brando carried the Roman on his shoulder and carried the elf and Chiara in his hands. He suddenly swooped forward. The sonic boom caused by the dive swept across the valley, like the sound of a bayonet splitting the air. The sharp blade brushed past Brando's body. Almost at the same time, Modesty's sharp claws swept across the place, leaving behind a dazzling golden flame mark in the air. Brando had already rolled on the ground and drilled into the nearby forest. The elf and Chiara were stunned. They opened their mouths wide, probably thinking that they were dead. When Brando got up from the ground and dragged them deeper into the forest, the two little Lolas screamed in fear. "Ah! How did you dodge it?" "Consciousness," Brando replied, gritting his teeth. In fact, it was not just the two Lolas. Even Modesty herself could not believe that her surefire dive had missed its target. She flew high into the sky with a series of wild laughter. When she looked back to see what she had done, she found that there was nothing in the valley. The black dragon's laughter came to an abrupt end. If one could see her face at this time, it would be terrible. The female black dragon roared, turned in the air again, and swooped down between the hills. The pressure once again descended from above. Brando felt that Modesty behind him was much more cautious this time. She was tightly locking onto his escape route. It was impossible to take the initiative like before. "Brando, she's coming again." Roman, who was carried on his shoulder, shouted. There was not much fear in his voice. Even Brando felt that this guy was too heartless. The current situation was a little too exciting for him. He felt his heart pounding in his chest. If he made a wrong decision, everyone would die in the dragon's stomach. However, the merchant girl seemed to have a blind faith in him, as if she was not worried that he would fail. "She's coming." Accompanied by her scream, the black dragon once again approached her from behind. Because the speed was too fast, the sound even began to distort. For the first time, the speed of Modesty's dive exceeded the speed of sound waves in the air. The dragon's wings seemed to have cut through an invisible barrier, and the airflow in front of her compressed into a white cloud. In the blink of an eye, she was left behind by Modesty. Brando could almost feel the needle-like feeling on his back. He put his hand into his pocket. In just a moment, Modesty flew past, and the cloud of fire fell on the forest, burning it instantly. She thought she had caught Brando, but when she looked up again, her claws were still empty. "This is impossible." A roar spread far and wide to the hills and forests within a radius of dozens of miles. Almost everyone could clearly hear the angry roar of the giant dragon in the air. Maynard led the diplomatic party through the forest. When she heard the roar, she suddenly stopped and looked back at the silver dragon lady, Mithril, who was at the back of the party. Mithril, who was wearing a white robe, was also looking up in that direction. Her expression was very bad, but her silver eyes were filled with a playful look. Modesty was known for her bad temper in the dragon race, but that did not mean she was a fool. There were many people in the dragon race who could toy with her, but outside of the dragon race, this was the first person she had seen. Is Brando doing well? Maynard paused for a moment and suddenly asked. Mithril shook her head, then nodded and replied softly, maybe not too good, but maybe not too bad. Allah's has a good eye. You know the leader, Lady Mithril? Enid asked in surprise. The silver dragon's transformation caused such a huge commotion that it was impossible to hide it from others. At this moment, almost everyone in the diplomatic party knew her true identity. That was why they were surprised. Although there was a rumor that Count Tonagel was related to the dragon race, it was rumored that it was only a young dragon. But the one in front of them was clearly a real adult dragon. Mithril smiled weakly at the curious humans. I can only say that I have heard of him. Is the Count very famous, big sister? The young daughter of the Grand Duke of Grenoires asked in a childish voice. Almost everyone could not help but smile bitterly when they heard this innocent question. Brando was indeed famous. Even if it was not before, but after this diplomatic mission, he was notorious, whether it was for the Cruz Empire or the Erewhon nobles. If it was not for this sudden war, he would have become the public enemy of all the nobles in the empires south of Anzaruta. And in the court, he had also offended a lot of powerful officials, led by Duke Palat. It was even said that Her Majesty the Queen had a lot of complaints about him. The Empire's complaints were simply earth-shattering for the nobles of the Erewhon. Before this diplomatic mission, no one would have thought that there was someone in this world who could cause so much trouble. In fact, in the Erewhon Empire, according to Oberway, Makarov was very regretful. He felt that it was the stupidest decision he had ever made in his life to let Brando go to Cruz as the leader of the diplomatic mission. The answer to this question was obvious, but everyone, including the nobles of Cruz, still stared at Mithril. After all, no one would not be curious about a real dragon's opinion, especially their opinion of humans. The silver dragon smiled and touched Judy's hair. She coughed twice and said, "He is indeed very famous." Everyone was a little stunned. Fame in human society was not worth mentioning in the eyes of the golden race. It was an almost eternal gaze. Power and vanity were like rotten wood in front of such a gaze. But Mithril gave a definite answer. Everyone thought that the silver dragon lady was coaxing a child, although they did not know if dragons would coax human children. Then Mithril continued, "I have heard some rumors about him. He is indeed related to us. I know that is rare among you humans. But not only that, I know that he has met William. He has a very good reputation among those people. Tumen and William both have high hopes for him." Tumen and William. Eugenie almost jumped up. "You mean the Silver Storm, William of Buga?" "More or less that young man," Mithril replied. "Oh, he is not young anymore. Bugas are immortal, but they will eventually grow old." Everyone present could not help but clatter their teeth when they heard this. Although Tumen was Erewhon, his legend did not stop in Erewhon. People knew him better by another name, the master of the Mithril fortress. Not to mention William, that name had become a godlike existence for nearly 1,000 years. There were countless legends about him in Wonde. The Cruz people in the forest could not help but change their expressions. They only knew that their opponent was a country bumpkin from Erewhon, but they did not expect that the other party was related to the Bugas. And it was not just a normal connection. Although they knew that Brando had the support of the Bugas, everyone took it for granted that it was the support of the Bugas for Erewhon. The reason was simple, because of the Azure Lance. But no one would have thought that the truth of this support turned out to be a one-sided support for Brando. Of course, they could hear that Mithril's tone was full of admiration. The silver dragon lady was speaking up for the Count. What kind of concept was that? For a moment, the Cruz people present suddenly felt at ease. No wonder the Count was so powerful, no wonder he dared to challenge the Empire. It turned out that he was backed by the Bugas. Everything made sense now. Sir Cooper and Earl Alcorn, who was beside him, looked at each other, and the same thought could be read in both of their eyes. They seemed to have done something that could not have been more stupid. But the silver dragon lady did not finish her words. She smiled and said, "You probably think that the Count is backed by the Bugis." She shook her head. "You are wrong. He treats the Bugis as friends and will never easily owe them a favor. His real ally is the Ring of the World. You may not know how high your Count's reputation is among the Druids. The great Druids of the Ring of the Sky may not be comparable to his current status." The forest was silent for a moment. Druids. If the Bugis still had the legends of Wonde, then the Druids would have long been a group of people who still existed in those illusory stories. Everyone knew that they really existed and existed at the border of the Black Forest. This group of wilderness people who guarded the border of the civilized world, no one knew exactly how powerful they were. The whole of Eloranta was just a part of the Ring of the World, the country that was still looked after by the Wise Ones, the home of the earth and mountains, nature and forests. Almost all humans knew that Eloranta rarely got involved in the affairs of the mortal world. Only the kingdom of the wild elves would participate in the Holy War, and those real high-end forces, together with the Druids, had not appeared in this world for nearly 1,000 years. And that was the Ring of the World. Some people even thought that they were already the Silver People, after the Bugis, after the Silver Elves, the last descendants of the Silver People born in the world of Wonde since the Age of Mortals. They turned out to be the Count's allies. As for Brando's identity, in fact, since he became famous, whether it was the Empire or Erewhon, countless people had speculated. Some guessed that he was a Wind Elf, because he had the Wind Archers and the White Lion Guards, but some guessed that he was a Templar, because it was said that someone had seen this lord use the armor of heaven. Some guessed that he was a dragon, and the reason was self-evident. Even about the Bugis, there were rumors, after all, that he had the azure lance and so many gargoyles in his hands. But no one would have thought that Brando's allies were the Druids. Mithril made it very clear that the relationship between the Druids and him was that of an ally, and between the two of them, the status of the Count of Tonagel seemed to be higher. Everyone seemed to feel a little confused for a moment. Evrim, who was covered in flesh, even slapped his face hard to confirm that he was not dreaming. Among everyone, only Brando's original subordinates were not surprised. Yuta even frowned, because she felt that this silver dragon was clearly exposing her master's background. There were several times when she wanted to go up and stop her, if it was not for Metisha who held her back. The silver elf princess slowly shook her head at the former. She stared in that direction, feeling very curious, but after all, her thoughts were different from Yuta's. She felt a little strange that the silver dragon lady was actually helping the Count to brag. She did not understand why the other party would do so, but at least she knew that her Count, whether it was in Bugis or the Ring of the World, was definitely not as respected as Mithril made it out to be. Moreover, the sly light that flashed in the silver dragon lady's eyes from time to time did not escape her eyes. And from the other party's narration, she could clearly feel that the nobles of Cruz and the other people in the envoy group had a subtle change in their attitude towards their Count. They were originally just a temporary gathering, but now, their reliance on their Count had further changed, and they had a lot of confidence in their Count. Metisha was even sure that these people's trust towards Brando was only temporary, but now it had obviously stabilized. She could predict that even after the end of this war, most of them would remember Brando's kindness to them. Humans were such a strange kind of creatures, and their instinct was to seek profit. But the question was, why would a giant dragon speak up for its lord for no reason? Metisha looked at Mithril with a strange expression. She knew very well how prideful this race was. In their eyes, humans were absolutely beneath them. She frowned and suddenly turned her head to the side and asked the Shire, "Did the Count tell us to support him?" The Shire shook his head slightly. At this moment, Brando really did not need support. In fact, he had led Modesty for at least a dozen miles. One of them was running in the forest, while the other was chasing in the air. During this time, the black dragon roared and swooped down countless times, but the problem was that she missed every time. She was about to go crazy because she still couldn't figure out what kind of trick the other party used to avoid her attack. Now, she was sure that the other party definitely didn't rely on some **T skill. He must have some strange magic equipment on him that could avoid her attack. In fact, Modesty had already guessed most of it. Every time she swooped down to Brando's side, she would feel a slight distortion in time, and then the other party would inexplicably run a step faster, causing her to miss. No matter how she calculated in advance or what kind of magic she used, in the end, it was useless in the end. And the only result was, she found that the abominable human below seemed to be beginning to weaken. But it's not like I'm really weak. Instead, he lost a level. Of course, he was relying on the elapsing needle to avoid Modesty's pursuit. As long as the black dragon swooped close to him, he would activate the elapsing needle for a moment to speed up a step or turn in a direction. With 10 times the time acceleration, no matter how terrifying the black dragon lady was, she could not catch him. But the only problem was the loss of experience. He had used the elapsing needle as sparingly as possible, but as time passed, he could not avoid losing a level. This was the first level. After that, it would get faster and faster. He could predict that if he continued running at this speed, he would lose 1.5 levels in the next 10 miles. And by the evening, not to mention his stamina, the level of the Frost Soil Guard would be the first thing he would lose. However, Brando was not in a hurry. He was not familiar with the Empire, and had never been to Enzlova, but he had heard of some places nearby. There were 2 smaller dungeons in the game in the Silver Gushing Valley. These 2 dungeons were not useful for his escape, but he knew that there was an entrance to Jorgendy Ridge between the 2 dungeons. That entrance was more special, and he believed that he should be able to escape the pursuit of this damned black dragon there. If he was not wrong, that place should be half an hour away from here, which meant that he would lose another 2 or 3 levels. At the thought of this, Brando felt very unhappy. But at this time, Kiara, who was in his hand, was even more unhappy. The whistling cold wind was about to freeze her face, but she could not throw a tantrum. After all, there was a dragon chasing after them. If she wanted to stay and be the dragon's dinner, the abominable fellow who was holding her would not mind. In order to prevent herself from being frozen, the little lady had to find a topic to talk about. Why did the demon slayer's spear explode? She asked with a trembling voice. Chapter 951. When Chiara raised this question, Brando had already figured out what the problem was. In the Amber Sword, any high-level magic equipment, except for divine artifacts and demigod artifacts, required a certain level of willpower to be used. However, there was one exception, and that was a magic item that stored mana. Previously, Wisp could use it without any hindrance. Using the Demon Slayer Spear itself showed that the Demon Slayer Spear was also a special type of magic item. There was a characteristic of magic storage items, and that was that after using it beyond its limit, there would be all kinds of unexpected dangers due to overloading. Just like his Ring of the Wind Empress and Freya's Ring of Flame, the same principle applied. However, people who had a little understanding of the characteristics of magic items generally would not joke about such things. The disintegration and explosion of magic items were considered light, but if there was a backlash or turbulence of the laws, it would be too late to cry. However, Wisp obviously did not know about this, and he had forgotten to remind her before, so he was too embarrassed to mention it to her for a while. Brando laughed perfunctorily to answer Chiara's question. The latter thought that he was unhappy and did not ask any more, so she pursed her lips and did not ask any more. The forest was rapidly receding from Brando's side, and the surrounding scenery gradually became blurred, as if it was a continuous dark green with brown and yellow. In fact, just as Chiara said, Brando was beginning to feel that he could not divert his attention to do anything else. Modesty was tired of the process of swooping down again and again, and she seemed to have thrown away the pride of a dragon. She simply spat fire left and right in midair. In this way, Brando's situation became precarious. The flame of the dragon could be said to be the most famous thing in countless legends, but it was different from the common imagination of mortals. The flame of the dragon often did not need to hit the opponent directly to cause damage. The temperature of this flame was unimaginably high. Often, a spark could ignite a forest. When a dragon flew over the forest, it did not even need to spit fire deliberately to ignite the whole forest. The same was true for the fire that they spat out directly. For a strong swordsman who had stepped into the realm of gold, as long as they entered the range of 50 meters, they would also end up in ashes. For Brando, it was slightly better. As long as he did not enter the range of 30 meters, he would be fine. However, he could withstand it, but the three ladies in his hands could not. For this reason, he had to extend the time limit of the elapse pointer, and the speed of the experience points loss was further accelerated. The second level of the Frost Earth Guard disappeared again. Brendel wanted to cry, but no tears came out. This meant that the EXP that Mithril gave him yesterday was almost gone. Fortunately, the vision in front of him suddenly there was a steep cliff, and a steep cliff was a valley. The place was the place he was surrounded by mountains. And mountains, he was the place. He was the entrance to the Underlands. At this time, the crackling sound of flames behind them was getting closer and closer. It meant that the black dragon Modesty was approaching. The latter seemed to have learned her lesson. She probably realized that she could not catch up with Brando, who had a demigod artifact. She simply followed behind while spitting fire, waiting for the little guy to exhaust himself. Then, she would slowly torture him. Brando did not dare to delay. He came to the edge of the cliff and jumped directly. Silver lines of law flashed, and the next moment, they appeared directly in the valley. Teleportation. Modesty, who was following closely behind, could not help but curse when she saw this scene. The dragon race's heritage was profound. In fact, she had already recognized that the demigod artifact in Brando's hand was the elapse pointer. But she did not expect that after chasing for almost half an hour, this little guy had a new trick, the law of space. The female black dragon felt that it was difficult to handle this time. Brando's tricks were endless. The trick had alerted her. But being alarmed was just being alarmed. She could not change what had happened. She could only flap her wings. The golden lines of law stretched out from under her wings and crossed half the sky in an instant. Like a giant arc-shaped net, it covered the area with a radius of dozens of miles. At the same time, Brando only felt a slight tightness on his body. The law of space that he had been able to feel clearly seemed to have disappeared. The connection was instantly cut off. He subconsciously looked up and saw the intertwined golden lines flashing continuously in midair. This was undoubtedly Modesty's law of space. The existence of the extreme flatlands could pull people into their own law world, and after the sage's domain, they could go one step further and project their own ultimate domain into this world. The relationship between the latter and the former was like the relationship between a clone and a projection, but the latter was much safer. At least, they would not make the fatal mistake of Williams. Brando was no stranger to the projection of the extreme flatlands. He had seen many of them in the previous world. But what he did not expect was that Modesty's law of space not only suppressed his weak law, but also suppressed the elapse pointer on his body. The consumption of the elapse pointer suddenly became violent, and the originally stable consumption suddenly doubled. This time, Brando could not stand it anymore. The Frost Earth Guard's level dropped again in the blink of an eye. The law of space could affect the divine artifact. Brando was also puzzled by this strange situation. Although the law of space could suppress most magical equipment, for example, in the extreme flatlands, the attributes of equipment below the fantasy tier would generally be less than 60%. But above the legendary tier, the divine artifact, and even the divine artifact, were the inherent laws of these two top-tier magical items. It was absolutely not affected by any law of space, and it was also very difficult to destroy. Just like Orf's Ring of Creation, it could only be destroyed with Mjolnir when all 7 sides of the ring appeared when the black moon moved in the sky. It was the same for the Elapse Pointer. As a divine artifact of time, the only way to destroy or affect it was to lose it to the Dark Abyss. In the stream of history beside Goddess Helene in the Dark Abyss. The problem was that the Dark Abyss was an illusory existence, so it was not wrong to say that the divine artifact of time was unparalleled and flawless. But now, it was affected. Even Modesty herself did not expect this to happen. Otherwise, she would not have to reason with Brando. She would have used it long ago. Brando would probably lose 7 or 8 levels after running for less than 10 minutes, let alone 30 minutes. When she was surprised to find Brando and the others in the valley, she could not help but scream in surprise, "Ha! So you're a Elapse Pointer." "The Elapse Pointer is not complete." Modesty's voice rumbled in the air, causing the ladies below to feel dizzy. When Brendel heard what she said, he finally understood what the problem was. His Elapse Pointer was only half complete, and he still lacked the backtrack disc. Therefore, although the Elapse Pointer in his hand had the effect of a divine artifact, its defensive power against the law of space was only at the level of an ancient item. For a moment, Brando could not help but curse. Fortunately, they were already at their destination. Otherwise, he would not be able to escape from Modesty's clutches even if he ran all the way to the ********. After Modesty was certain that Brendel could not escape from her grasp, she could not help but become more relaxed in mid-air, as if she was no longer angry, nor was she roaring angrily. For a moment, she even seemed to be at ease. She hovered in mid-air, like a feline teasing its prey, looking at the few little mice below with a teasing gaze, as if she was trying to say, "What are you doing? Why don't you run again?" Of course, this was also because she could not catch up with them for the time being. Whether it was Brando or the female black dragon, both of them seemed to be relieved at the same time. The former was victory in sight, while the latter was revenge. The hills were far away from the main human settlements and roads of the empire. Bushes grew between the hills, giving it the appearance of a primeval forest. Weeds and thorns filled the space between the trees. Brendel forced a path through the thorny branches, and insects fell from the trees like rain. Amidst the screams of the 3 ladies, he finally rushed out of the forest like an arrow. Looking up, there was an obvious subsidence on the ground in front of him. There was a fault under the rock layer. Brando initially estimated that it should be a landform. The passage was there. Brando could not help but let out a long sigh of relief. Caterpillar. There are spiders in your hair. Ah, here too. Behind me, behind me. The Wisp and Kiera screamed as they grabbed each other's shoulders and collars. Brendel looked at this pair of clowns and could not help but sigh. He casually picked up a green worm from the Wisp's back. To be honest, it was a little disgusting. He frowned and threw the worm behind him. The forest there was already afire. In the sea of fire, this little bug had only exploded into a ball of bright sparks in the sea of fire before turning into ashes. He looked up again, and Modesty had landed on a hill not far away. She flapped her wings and looked down at the little guys who had stopped in the valley. She asked arrogantly in a mocking tone, "Not running anymore?" Bossies always die because they talk too much. Brando thought. He was a little strange. At this time, the other party should have seen the entrance. He really did not understand why she was still calm. He looked back and suddenly realized that the female dragon had landed in the wrong place. There was a short hill in front of the mountain that she was on, which blocked her line of sight. Brando could not help but be secretly happy. At least, in a sense, it meant that Martha was still on their side. This was a good sign. Although he thought that even if the other party saw the crack, she might not be able to stop them in time. He still had the elapsed needle and the charge skill. However, Kiera and the elf, who he was holding, did not think so. The former looked at Modesty's shadow and could not help but gulp, while the latter's teeth were almost chattering. Brando took a few steps back in that direction, and then said to Modesty, "Lady Modesty, I heard that you used to have another name. What does it have to do with you? Don't try to stall for time, little guy." "In my kingdom, your power of law is useless," Modesty said arrogantly. Modesty replied arrogantly. The projection of the extreme planes was a realm of laws that belonged exclusively to one person. In this realm, she was both the king and the master. It was not an exaggeration to say that she controlled life and death. Therefore, Modesty's there was nothing wrong with what he said. "I'm just curious," Brando replied as he stepped back in that direction. "What's your original name, Maxine?" "Ha!" If Modesty was a little vigilant a moment ago, she was really curious now. "You actually know my name. Did Mithril tell you?" That wasn't the case, but the game did mention their real names. But Brendel only knew that they came up with another name after the dragons were expelled. After all, names were sacred symbols in the eyes of the witches, Myrnas, and dragons. This theory was also rumored among the devils, and the devils' real names were a typical example. So when they became sinners, the devils' real names were a typical example. Because of this, their original names were not allowed to be used. As for what the three dragons had done, Brando actually did not know. Modesty was right. He was just trying to stall for time. He deliberately pretended as if he knew a lot and continued, "The Black Witch Glinda, the Pillar Goddess Modesty, and the Unseen Prophet Malthus. The fake names of the three of you obviously have other meanings. I'm curious, why did the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn, Aubustian, and you leave the Valley of the Giant Dragons at that time?" Modesty sneered. "You really know a lot. Mithril definitely won't tell you these things. I'm curious, where did you learn them from? Unfortunately, you won't get any answers from me. And you're getting further and further away from me. Are you trying to sneak away from me? Where are you going?" "Into the rat hole behind you." The female black dragon sneered. "You've chosen a good place. Unfortunately, not everything in this world is as you wish." Brando was horrified. He said so much just to divert the attention of the damned female lizard. Although he was indeed very curious about the origin and past of the three dragons, he was just asking casually. He did not expect Modesty to give him an answer. But what he didn't expect was that this female black dragon had not only seen through his superficial intentions, but had also seen through his deeper intentions. She had already seen the passage behind him that led to the underground. Then why did this damned female lizard stay here and chat with him for so long? Even if he used his knees to think, he knew that she was not really going to have a peaceful tea party with him. The other party must have a reason to be fearless. Modesty did not intend to hide her reasons. "I can only say that you're unlucky," she sneered. "Today, Lady Martha is on my side." At the same time, a terrifying aura suddenly rose from behind Brando. The coldness in the aura was very similar to Malthus, but more powerful and majestic. Brando subconsciously turned his head and found that another black dragon had appeared on a mountain behind him. No, he did not even know if he should call her a dragon because she was extremely large. It was huge, even bigger than Malthus and Modesty combined. She stood behind the hill, and the whole hill could only accommodate one of her claws. This was simply one of those terrifying behemoths in the legends. Even the oldest dragon Brando had seen in his previous life, the golden dragon King Abius, was far from the size of this black dragon. This was a female dragon. She had 3 pairs of horns, and a single horn that looked like a unicorn's. When Brando saw the horn, his eyes narrowed slightly. He immediately recognized the other party's identity, Dragon Queen Gwendolyn. However, he had never seen the Dragon Queen before, nor had he ever heard of her having 3 pairs of horns. In his memory, there was only one other dragon with such an eye-catching feature, the 7 Extremities Dragon King, the evil dragon Fuchsia. Dragon Queen Gwendolyn was the evil dragon Fuchsia. That legendary mystic dragon from the end of the world. Brando immediately thought that his idea was crazy. Even in the game of his time, it was far from the time of the birth of this mystic dragon. Some people even thought that the evil dragon Fuchsia was the Twilight Dragon, the final boss of the Amber Sword. But from the looks of it, it was obviously not. Because this mountainous dragon exuded the purest, most dark, but also the power of order. This power was the same as that of the witches, the Myrnas and Madara. Brando felt like he had been petrified. Just now, he thought that bosses always died because they talked too much. He did not expect his prediction to come true. He guessed the beginning correctly, but not the end. Because the boss in this sentence was actually him, and not Modesty. He suddenly thought of something. Didn't he have the so-called elite template? That thing was barely in the game. It could be said that it was a mini-boss. Brendel wanted to slap himself in the face. At this moment, Romaine, who was lying on his shoulder, seemed to have realized that things were getting out of hand. Even with her thick nerves, she could not help but look at the 2 dragons. She had to admit that one of them was so big. She asked cautiously, "Brando, are we going to be eaten by them?" "I'm afraid it's worse than that." Brando thought to himself. In front of Gwendolyn, even Modesty did not dare to speak carelessly. Gwendolyn looked down at Brendel from above. Her eyes were very different from the average black dragon. If Malthus and Modesty's eyeballs were like 2 huge balls of graphite, then Gwendolyn's eyes were like lava balls, emitting traces of golden light in the darkness. From afar, one could feel that she was cold and full of the majesty of a king. Gwendolyn finally spoke, "Little one, where did you hide Halran Gaia?" The first sentence was like a bolt of lightning that struck Brando. He opened his mouth wide, but could not say a word. How did she see it? Halran Gaia was hidden in the dimensional space. If she could see the things in the dimensional space, wouldn't that mean that she could see through space? What level of power was this? Brando was already a little confused. You don't have to doubt it. I can feel its presence, but I can't guess where you hid it, Gwendolyn replied coldly. If you don't answer me, I'll have to find out the answer myself. Accompanying this sentence was a cold killing intent. Chapter 952. The double pressure pressed down on Brando at the same time, almost immobilizing him. However, his mind did not stop as he racked his brains to find a way to escape. They were indeed looking for Halran Gaia, however, it was only a damaged weapon after all. Although it was said to be the only important symbol of the Earth Holy Temple out of the 3 divine artifacts, that was something that happened nearly 1,000 years ago. In these 1,000 years, the Earth Holy Temple's decline was not because of the loss of the 3 divine artifacts, but because they had violated the sacred covenant back then. Since that was the case, even if it was the Earth Holy Temple, even if Halran Gaia returned to the Temple of Earth, it would be useless. Moreover, the dragons did not believe in Gaia. They were the people of the sky. If the 3 dragons were banished to the ground and became believers of the Temple of Earth, Brando would never believe such a ridiculous thing. But if that was the case, why would they come here personally to look for Halran Gaia, even going against the oath of the dragons to leave Jorgendi Ridge? Finally, was this sword the reason why the people of Jorgendi Ridge started the war? What Brando wanted to confirm now was how important Halran Gaia was to these dragons, and whether he could use it to threaten them. After all, Halran Gaia was still in his dimension hole. If he died, although the dimension hole would not be destroyed by the loss of mana, the things inside it might not be able to be kept. If one or two items were lost in the space vortex, it would be a good thing. If he happened to have Halran Gaia, the dragons would not be able to accept it. The key question was whether they dared to take the risk. If Halran Gaia was not that important to them, they might not care about such a risk. However, Brando felt that the possibility of this was very small. Should I call you Gwendolyn or Fuchsia, the respected dragon lady? These thoughts ran through his mind, but he didn't show them on his face. He didn't even frown as he asked calmly. You do know a lot. I am related to Fuchsia, but it is not her. The Dragon Queen did not seem to care about this little secret. She narrowed her eyes and replied bluntly. Is he Fuchsia's descendant? Brando paused for a moment, thinking that this explanation was more plausible. After all, the evil dragon Fuchsia had been sealed 1,000 years ago, and it was impossible for her to sneak out without the dragons noticing. Not to mention, the Buka people were involved in the sealing as well. These craftsmen sorcerers who claimed that they did not interfere with the affairs of the mortal world had set up all sorts of monitoring points all over the world to observe the mortal world. The lower realm. He didn't know why Fuchsia was sealed, so he couldn't be sure of Gwendolyn's attitude. But this had nothing to do with him, so he pondered for a moment before continuing. The thing you are looking for, according to the mortals and dwarves, is called Halran Gaia, or Halran Gaia. It is indeed with me. However, Halran Gaia had been permanently damaged 1,000 years ago. Although it was known as the symbol of the Earth Holy Temple, it didn't seem to be the original meaning of its existence. It was just a far-fetched meaning added to it by the later generations. It's there. In this world, it's the same as many famous swords that are known as sacred swords. I don't think it's worthy of the Dragon Queen's personal visit. Kid, you talk a lot of nonsense. Modesty interrupted him impatiently. You're still stalling for time. Do you think you still have a chance to turn the tables? No, it's just a mortal's curiosity. Brando was shocked and quickly explained. Idle curiosity, Modesty replied. Brando looked at Gwendolyn. He didn't care about the answer to the question, but the latter's attitude. It didn't matter if she answered him or not, as long as she made a statement, it was enough. Gwendolyn, as usual, didn't care about his little thoughts, as if she had unlimited time and didn't mind Brando stalling for a little longer. She replied coldly, how can divine artifacts be destroyed so easily? They are the symbols of Tiamat. Every divine artifact corresponds to the most basic laws of this world. The change of order, and in these changes, the fate of mortals will be changed. Although Halran Gaia is damaged, the laws it represents still exist. It has reappeared in the world through your hands, which means it has a mission that must be completed. The corner of the Dragon Queen's mouth rose slightly, as if it was a silent mockery. Unless Tiamat wants to change the world, divine artifacts won't appear so easily. They are the key to changing the future, and you think it's a broken piece of scrap metal. Brando's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't that he hadn't heard of this before. Among the players in the other world, this saying was also very popular. Because in the Amber Sword, divine artifacts were very difficult to destroy. To destroy a divine artifact, one often had to meet all kinds of conditions, and the condition to destroy Halran Gaia was to throw it into the Lake of Beginnings deep in the earth. But it was no ordinary lake, but the core of the earth. A sea of magma, about which only people had ever heard of, and no one had ever seen it. So, Halran Gaia was always damaged, and never destroyed. Then there was a problem. Could the damaged Halran Gaia bring about the so-called divine artifact mission like other divine artifacts? According to the game, the divine artifact mission was a kind of mission that rewarded in advance. The divine artifact was the final reward of the mission, but you could get it first. Because of the uniqueness of the divine artifact, the subdivine artifact did not have this characteristic. The subsequent missions were often astonishingly difficult and wide-ranging, and often even permanently changed the history of a region or even a country. Just like the 24 Rings of the Wind Empress, or the fragments of the Flaming Blade, it was a mission that could definitely cause an earthquake in the power core of Saint Tossol or the Cruz Empire. But the problem was that Halran Gaia was a broken divine artifact. Its power was in fact only at the upper level of a fantasy weapon, and was not even comparable to most of the legendary equipment, such as the powerful Demon Slayer spear. Therefore, if the Halran Gaia also brought the same difficult mission challenge to the wielder, the design, while realistic, was a little too unreasonable. Brando had not thought about the problems of this world from the perspective of the game recently, but when Gwendolyn said this, out of survival instinct, he immediately thought of this possibility. Could it be that all this was the chain of the Halran Gaia's mission? No, impossible. He shook his head. The implications were too broad. Jorgandi Ridge invaded Cruz. Because this level of historical change could only be the advancement of history brought about by the chapter change in the game. Just like from the legend of the stag and the empire to the era of war and chaos, and then the war slate was unearthed for the first time, triggering the return of the silver folk to the mortal world, and thus the second era. Everything that was happening now was very likely to be such a sign. Brando felt that the most likely to cause all of this should be the Azure Lance, and not the Halran Gaia. He pondered for a while, and finally made a decision. He slowly raised his hand, and a black line appeared in the palm of his hand. At that moment, Gwendolyn and Modesty both saw the thing clearly. Dimension hole. Gwendolyn obviously did not expect Brando to have such a thing. This was not the Amber Sword game. In the game, dimension holes and dimensional bags were commonplace. The equipment was more common among the players because the former was sold in the game store. The game company could not really let the players drive a fleet of cars and wander around with big and small bags on their backs. But in fact, in the background of the story, dimension holes were a relatively rare thing. Just think of its original owner, a high-ranking priest of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, who was also a core member of All for One, and it went without saying that he only had one. Dimension holes were not rare for the dragon race, but the Dragon Queen did not expect that a mere count of a border kingdom would have such a thing. No wonder, Modesty screamed. Yesterday, Malthus and I clearly felt the aura of the Halran Gaia, but it disappeared in an instant. It must be you. Gwendolyn interrupted her, and looked at Brando with some surprise. You felt Modesty and Malthus's tracking of the Halran Gaia. How far were they from you? Modesty also reacted. No, he was not too close to us, or Malthus and I would not have lost him. Even if he put the Halran Gaia into the dimension hole, we could still find him based on the aura of the Halran Gaia before it disappeared. He must have been quite a distance away when he found us. Interesting. The female black dragon stared at Brando with burning eyes. Little worm, it seems that you have many secrets. Gwendolyn frowned, and only asked one question. You are the descendant of that human. Brando was slightly stunned, and instinctively realized who she was asking. He raised his head and looked at the legendary Dragon Queen in disbelief. What? Modesty was shocked. He is related to that guy. I don't understand what you are talking about, my lady. Brando said in a low voice. At this time, he knew that he could not escape, so he put down Kiara and the elf. The latter two were shivering either from fear or from the cold. The merchant lady who jumped down from his shoulder seemed to be particularly energetic. She looked at Gu with a mixture of fear, caution, and curiosity. She looked at Gu with a look that was a mixture of fear, caution, and curiosity. Gwendolyn, and then looked at Modesty behind her. Then she quickly realized that the two dragons' gazes, which had been on Brendel all this time, had actually shifted to her. At this moment, even the heartless Romaine could not help but hide behind Brando. Both Modesty and Gwendolen looked at the Roman, and the latter spoke again. "You know who I am asking about. Human, your grandfather. You humans call him the sacred swordsman Darius, but we call him the dragon of Harag. You should understand what I mean." Although Brando had expected this, his heart could not help but beat violently. The dragon of Harag, he vaguely remembered that he had heard this name before. "You know my grandfather." Although he asked this verbally, he had vaguely connected the scattered clues into a complete line in his heart. Whether it was the princess or Lady Veronica, they had mentioned that the dragons were behind the changes in the Holy War, and the two dragons in front of him, along with Malthus, were obviously the truth. The reason why they were exiled was self-evident. Although he still did not know when they were exiled, he could make a guess. The time when the dragons were exiled was obviously not long, and their names were not mentioned in the history of the war under Georgiandy Ridge. If they were exiled within 100 years, then the most likely time was between 60 to 40 years ago. That was the time when the Holy War happened. The three of them were the ones who experienced the incident, and might even be the key figures in it. What did they do to be exiled? But this time, Gwendolen was silent, and only answered briefly. "We are not familiar with each other, but we do know each other." "What happened back then?" Brando asked tentatively. "There are some things you better not know." Gwendolen's tone was a little gentler. "We owe your grandfather a favor, and for this favor, if you hand over Halran Gaia today, we can let you go. As long as you take your people and leave Cruz immediately, everything that happened here will have nothing to do with you from now on." She looked up and looked at Modesty opposite her. "Modesty?" The female black dragon replied unwillingly, "All right, I'll listen to you. Even the dragon race owes him a favor." Brendel did not expect his grandfather to be so awesome. But on the one hand, he was a little unhappy. The dragons also owed the Silver Queen a favor, and then they helped the latter to ascend the throne. This was not a small matter, because it not only involved the replacement of the throne of a huge empire like Cruz, but also involved the balance of the mortal world. The Bugis would never stand by and watch the balance between the mortal forces. The Silver Folk and the Golden Folk had agreed in the sacred covenant that they would no longer be involved in mortal affairs. For the Dragon Clan to do so, they had to at least convince the Bugis and the Silver Elves. The dragons paid such a high price to return the favor to the Silver Queen, and his grandfather. Not only was he blamed and wronged, he was an extreme swordsman, but he was actually a nameless miller for the rest of his life, and his grandfather's lifespan was almost the same as an ordinary person's. You can imagine the price he paid back then, and the difference in treatment. It was a little too big. The worst thing was that Brando, who was supposed to be of noble birth, the grandson of swordsman Darius, was reduced to being a militia in a barren place like Butchie. This has got to be a joke. Of course, Brando's heart was just a little scornful. After all, if history had developed this way, he might not have been able to come to this world. What he was really unhappy about was the attitude of Gwendolen and Modesty at this moment. He shook his head gently. "Lady Gwendolen, I don't expect you to return any favors. Although I really don't want to get involved in the muddy waters of the Cruz Empire, before you ask me to leave here, you'd better listen to my request." "Oh." Modesty was slightly startled. She did not expect this little bug-like guy to dare to make conditions to them. She asked with some amusement, "What are your conditions?" "Let's hear them." "My request is very simple. I came to the Empire to bring back a person," Brando replied. It was not that Brando could not turn around and leave. He and the princess both knew that the so-called envoy group was just a sham. As long as he could bring back Scarlet, he could not be bothered to go to Rushta to see Her Majesty the Queen. But as long as Scarlet was still in the Empire, he would never turn back. Whether there was a dragon in front of him or something else, it did not mean anything to Brando. It did not mean anything. Gwendolyn thought for a moment and understood what he was referring to. The Dragon Queen seemed to know everything that happened in the Empire during this period. She shook her head and said, "I'm afraid not. She is not important, but the important thing is the Azure Lance. You should know her value to Cruz. The Silver Queen will not let her go. This woman is a danger to you. Trouble, I advise you to stay away from her." Brando could still maintain his calm, but when he heard this, he could not help but be angry. Mortals were afraid of dragons, but he was not. He coldly corrected Gwendolyn, "She is my friend, not trouble. This so-called trouble is forced on her by the bandits of Cruz." "So what?" Gwendolyn's face was cold. "The Empire is stronger than you. You can only accept this fact in front of them." Brando took a deep breath. "But the Empire is also your enemy, isn't it? The Azure Lance is not important to me. I only want the person. You are determined to get the staff of Halran Gaia, so you will not let go of the Azure Lance." Gwendolyn shook her head without hesitation. "That's impossible." "Why?" Brando was a little confused. He wondered if these dragons were crazy. The way they did things was simply unbelievable. In his opinion, since they had the same enemy and shared the same interests, not to mention that they owed his grandfather a favor, it was reasonable for them to cooperate. But the other party not only refused, but also refused. So resolutely. "Because it is too troublesome," Gwendolyn replied. "We are not short of help." "So this is your way of returning the favor? How unique." Brando replied coldly. "Think what you will." Gwendolyn remained cold. "As I said, because we are stronger than you, you must accept this fact." Brando sneered, thinking that these two female lizards thought that he was begging them. "It seems that you two think you're going to get it. Is it not?" Modesty replied in a shrill voice, "I can't think of any other tricks you can play." "That is because your brain is too slow," Brando replied mercilessly. "The staff of Halran Gaia is in the dimensional cave. If you think you have it, you can come kill me and take it away yourself. Ladies, you can try." Gwendolyn and Modesty were stunned. Chapter 953. The probability of Halran Gaia collapsing due to the mana disintegration of the dimensional hole was very small, not much higher than a person being struck by lightning under a cloudless sky. Moreover, Halran Gaia was a true divine artifact, and it would never be destroyed. At most, it would be lost in some unknown space, perhaps in an unknown corner of Wonde, or in an elemental plane. If it was unlucky, it could be in one of the countless broken half-planes or dimensional fragments outside the boundaries of the law of Tiamat. If Halran Gaia was lost in one of those places, mortals would never be able to find it even if they spent their entire lives searching for it. But for dragons, they might be able to find it again one day. After all, time was not a threshold for dragons. They were immortal. Would Modesty and Gwendolyn dare to gamble? Brando stared at the two dragons, and could tell from their expressions that they did not dare to gamble. Even if it was only 1 in 100,000, or 1 in a million, who could be sure that Lady Martha would not play a joke on you? Brando was keenly aware of this from their hesitation. Although he had already come to the same conclusion from their tough tone, it was now confirmed. Gwendolyn and Modesty only had one chance to use Halran Gaia, and they could not afford to lose. Brando secretly breathed a sigh of relief. Although it did not mean that he was out of danger, at least it meant that he could buy more time. Now, both sides were almost back to the same starting line. Although Modesty and Gwendolyn still held the initiative. "Mortal, this idea of yours is very dangerous," the Dragon Queen replied coldly. The chill in her voice seemed to cause the entire valley to howl with cold winds and a layer of frost to fall. "Are you saying that you want to use this to blackmail us?" "Lady Dragon, I don't have a choice." Brendel replied frankly, spreading out his hands with a helpless look. It was Kiara's first time seeing the ruffian side of the Count, but the former's fearless calmness made her eyes twinkle slightly. She thought to herself, this bad guy isn't as useless as the rumors say. Previously, Brendel was always in an advantageous position, giving out orders confidently. But now, they were in a completely disadvantageous position. It could even be said that their lives were in the hands of others, but the other party was also neither servile nor overbearing, which made her look at him in a new light. The trait of a gambler who did not care about life or death and was staking everything on one throw surprised Chiara, who was used to seeing the cautious nobles of the kingdom. She had never seen such a noble before. However, Chiara was more annoyed than anything else. Since this guy dared to contradict the two dragons, he would most likely make things worse. In fact, it was not that there was no other way to solve the problem. She really did not know why he was so angry. Couldn't he satisfy the vanity of the dragons? What an idiot. What she did not understand the most was why this guy could not forget his subordinate. Wasn't she just a pawn? Since she was already in this position, she should have learned to abandon the pawn to save the king. Kindness and naivety were destined to have no fate with nobles. You have more than one subordinate, at least for now. There are all of us in this diplomatic group. Chiara could not help but clench her sharp little canine teeth, full of resentment. She did not know how this damn guy's brain worked. She secretly tugged at Brando's sleeve a few times, but the latter seemed to know what she was going to say and turned a deaf ear. Chiara was afraid and angry at the same time. If it were not for her small size that did not attract attention, and the two dragons did not notice her when she jumped up a few times, she was afraid that she would have taken the initiative to interrupt the two dragons and one man at this moment to state her conditions. The Roman was very obedient. She always believed in Brando unconditionally in situations where he was present. However, this did not mean that the merchant lady was obedient and sensible. It was probably because she had the mentality that if the sky fell, there would be someone taller to hold it up. Among the four of them, only the elf was so scared that she did not dare to move. Xianni was also hiding in her hood, mumbling something. After listening to Brando's answer, the two dragons' faces became very unfriendly, but they did not answer for a long time. Brando also waited quietly. He was actually very puzzled. He wondered if this matter was really so difficult for the two dragons. Their enemy was Cruz, and it was almost the same for him. He did not even ask for help to take back Scarlet, he just wanted a promise that he could leave Enzlova safely, reach the capital of the empire, and cause trouble for Cruz. Both sides clearly had the same interests, but the other side was not willing to do it. Was the dragon's face so valuable? The dragons he had encountered in the Amber Sword were not like this at all. Most of them were more like Alaz and Sheeta, haggling over every detail and being very pragmatic. Brendel instinctively felt that something was amiss. He repeatedly thought about his request, trying to figure out where it conflicted with the other party's interests, but he could not find a single clue even after racking his brains. These two dragons are really crazy. That was the only conclusion he came up with. Brando waited. He had already shown his last card, and now all he had to do was wait for the other party's answer. But to his disappointment, Gwendolyn shook her head in the end. "Mortal, your request will not change?" the Dragon Queen asked indifferently. Brando nodded. "Maybe you still want to get lucky." Gwendolyn seemed to be very reluctant to say such words, but she frowned and continued. "But I want you to understand one thing. The sword of Halran Gaia in your dimensional cave is indeed a very troublesome matter. But for the dragons, it is not unsolvable. We just don't want to waste time. If you think that a dimensional cave alone can stop us, then you are very, very wrong." The Dragon Queen's voice rumbled above the valley. Brendel frowned slightly after hearing it. Of course, he knew that the Dragon Queen was right. His trump card was not unsolvable for the Dragon Queen. First of all, as he had expected, even if Halran Gaia was lost, it was not impossible for them to find it. It was just that they would have to waste a lot of time and even invest a lot of manpower and material resources. There was also a second possibility, and that was to find a way to subdue him before they killed him. If he lost consciousness, then it would not be so difficult for the dragons to open the dimensional cave. It would be very easy for 2 adult dragons to subdue him, provided that he did not have the elapsing needle. And now, if they were not careful, it would backfire on them. Brando's heart was clear, and naturally understood the real reason why Modesty and Gwendolyn were concerned. After Gwendolyn finished her advice, she paused for a moment, and continued, "I don't understand why you are so stubborn. She is just a human woman. She has no birth or background, and the only thing she can rely on is the Azure Lance. But if you don't care about the Azure Lance, why do you have to make things difficult for yourself on this matter? Don't you get it? She is now at the center of a whirlpool, and is a potential threat to you. What you should do now is to distance yourself from her as much as possible, and not barge in like a moth to a flame." The Dragon Queen's words became cold in the end. "Don't be stupid. You are a smart person, and you can't see the pros and cons of this. Little one, I am warning you because of your grandfather." In a way, Gwendolyn's words made sense. There were many things in this world that could not be done as one wished. Wanting to do it and finally doing it were 2 very different things. It was normal in most situations to have ideals in one's heart, but to be unable to move forward in the end. Humans were a race that sought advantages and avoided disadvantages, and this was an animal's instinct for self-protection. In front of Brando were 2 dragons and a huge and powerful empire, and behind him, the people of Erewhon were not even united. The kingdom wanted to protect every one of its people, but even he knew that if this sentence was put in the kingdom, any noble would praise it as a great line, but in reality, everyone thought that it was a subconscious slogan. It sounded beautiful, but it might not be done. After all, they were Cruz's people. Not to mention, there was still Gwendolyn and Modesty in front of him. In the eyes of anyone, Brando's choice to back down now would not have any moral issues. In fact, he had done well enough, and how many lords would dare to openly cause trouble in the Empire for a subordinate? Based on this point alone, no one in Erewhon would dare to say that he was a greedy and vile person who used the name of righteousness as an excuse. The reason was simple: if you were not convinced, you could try challenging the Empire. But there was a limit to human strength. Gwendolyn's words were already making concessions as much as possible, and Chiara could not help but feel anxious. Even the dragons had given him a way out, and if he still insisted, it would be suicide. Abandoning the pawn to save the king, wasn't that simple? Chiara really did not understand why this guy with a wooden fish head did not say a word. Brando did not answer directly. Although he did not understand why Gwendolyn and Modesty were causing trouble for him, the truth was right in front of him. If he wanted to go to Rushta, he must first overcome this obstacle. As for what he should choose in his heart, Brando did not think too much about it, because he already had an answer. At this moment, he felt like a patient with terminal delusions. Reason and logic seemed to have nothing to do with him. He told himself in his heart, if I give up Scarlet, then what am I left with? He examined his experiences ever since he came to this world. Everything he said and did, although it might not be clear, they all followed the same belief. He did not ask for it to be logical, but to have a clear conscience. If he gave up on this belief, then why did he come back to this world? Brando did not think that he could convince himself. If that was the case, then he would just do it. A person could stop, but he could not leave behind regrets. Then, Brando answered, the negotiation has broken down. He said, actually, I am also very sorry. But I still don't understand. Brando shook his head and asked in confusion, what is the offense of my request to the 2 esteemed ladies? Chiara almost jumped up. She was stunned. She thought that Brando would definitely use this as an excuse to step down. Unless he was a real lunatic, he would not let himself die for such a thing. Although after these days of interaction, she already knew that this guy was a relatively decent person, but there were many decent people in Erewhon, and they would never break off their relationship with the two dragons for such a thing. Even if some people did not care about their own lives, the problem was that Brando was a lord. What about the other people under him? Would he not care? Would those people let this lord do as he pleased? This was a joke. Chiara subconsciously looked at the Roman, but the merchant lady raised her small eyebrows as if Brando's choice was completely justified. It would be strange if he did not make such a choice. However, Chiara could not help but feel annoyed. Did these people not realize one thing? They were about to become delicious barbecued meat. What kind of people were that merchant lady and that blockhead lord? At this time, Brando took a step back. Chiara was shocked when she saw this. With her intelligence, of course, she could see that the Count was going all out. At this time, she did not have time to think about anything else. She was a well-known genius in House Cipher, but she had an even more outstanding brother. That was why she had always been hidden, so her reputation wasn't known to the outside world. Chiara had always been full of confidence in her own mind. Even in this most dangerous moment, she was no exception. She was still angry at Brando for dragging her down, but when Brando moved, she immediately clearly judged the current situation and what she should do. That guy over there, since you have chosen to do this, damn it, you are a brainless idiot. Forget it, it is useless to say this now. I have something to tell you. She was hoping that Brando would give in, but this time, she shouted decisively, they will not help you. You must not hope that these two dragons will change their minds, because they are on the side of the Silver Queen. There is only one traitor in the Empire, and that is Her Majesty the Queen. As soon as Brendel heard this, he stopped what he was about to do. He could not help but stare at Chiara in surprise. He wondered what was wrong with this little lady. Was she so scared that she started talking in her sleep? Chiara's shout echoed in the valley. Gwendolyn and Modesty, who were about to subdue Brando, also stopped and looked at the little girl beside Brando in surprise. They had never paid attention to each other, but when Chiara said this, their thoughts were pulled back to reality. The look on their faces clearly proved that Chiara was not lying. On the contrary, she had guessed correctly. I don't have time to explain it to you, Chiara replied impatiently. She grabbed Brando's arm, and then roughly told him the information she got from Boris Anvil and Shagos. After that, she shouted loudly, "Quick, take us out of here. You may be a little stupid, but you are not a real lunatic. I know you must have a way." Of course, she knew that once she revealed these secrets, there would be no turning back for both sides. And this was her purpose. Since she could see that Brando was going to fight to the death, she could not let this blockhead be distracted and cause everyone to lose their lives. It was better to completely dispel the doubts between him and the two dragons. She did not want to be killed by an idiot for no reason. Of course, Brando did not know that in Chiara's heart, he was already a simple-minded idiot. But the little one's sudden change in attitude still startled him. He pulled Chiara to his side, picked up the little elf, and let Roman grab his arm at the same time. At least Chiara was right about one thing. Indeed, he was not completely powerless to fight back. Brando immediately activated the elapsed needle, but this time, he did not activate it for a moment like before, and then immediately turn it off. For the first time, he activated the subdivine artifact continuously. 10 times the elapsed time instantly, and the entire scenery in the surrounding forest slowed down. The falling leaves, the slowly dancing flames, and the dancing dust formed a very strange landscape. At this moment it was a world that had slowed down 10 times for Brando and the others, or rather, for Gwendolyn and Modesty, it was a world that had sped up 10 times for Brando. Brando estimated the time he needed, and then bitterly realized that he needed to activate the elapsed needle for at least 10 minutes to escape safely into the underground tunnel without being chased by the 2 dragons. 10 minutes. This was like returning to the rhythm before liberation in a single day. At the same time, there was another problem. And that was that Gwendolyn and Modesty had no way to break his elapsed needle. Both Gwendolyn and Modesty saw Brando's figure flash and disappear at the same time. They watched the scene happen from above, but did not seem too surprised. After all, they already knew that he had the elapsed needle. The Dragon Queen glanced at Modesty, and the latter nodded slightly at her. The 2 dragons spread their wings at the same time and flew up from the valley. P.S. As for why there was a 3 yesterday. That was because it was to confuse the mechanism. The power of the mechanism is so strong that I have to keep a low profile as much as possible. So in the future, if you see a wrong title or something like that, it must be the mechanism scheme. Don't be surprised. Chapter 954. The moment Brando moved, he felt a few obscure black lines of law seeping into his surroundings. These lines of law seeped into the temporal precepts woven by the elapsing needle, causing the silver temporal precepts to begin to disintegrate, and instantly slowing down the accelerated passage of time. These lines of law gave people a very strange feeling, and their expression was very strange. The precepts they spoke of were clearly not as violent and impulsive as Modesty and Malta's superior fire elemental precepts, the golden flames, but with a chilling sharpness, like an assassin's dagger dipped in poison. Brando almost immediately determined that this was a precept related to death. This was the precept of the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn. Death and golden flames were the 2 most important elements of a black dragon. The latter was more common among dragons, while the former mainly came from the bloodline of the 7 Dragons King, which indirectly proved Gwendolyn's identity. But the key was that he did not expect Gwendolyn's elemental power to have grown to such a level. If Modesty was unconsciously affecting the elapsing needle's time domain, then the Dragon Queen was actively interfering. Under the interference of the few black lines of laws, the elapsing needle's effect was almost halved. Within this region, Gwendolyn's law in this area, Gwendolyn's elemental precepts clearly had the upper hand. Although she had not become the only ruler, she was suppressing the other elements and precepts, preventing them from fully functioning. That was terrifying enough. The elapsing needle was a genuine subdivine artifact. The so-called divine artifacts and subdivine artifacts were naturally sacred objects created by the hands of the gods. Even if incomplete, it was still a domain that ordinary people could not touch. Gwendolyn's power was close to the peak of the sage realm, and there were signs that she was about to step into the world with a complete body. This discovery made Brendel's heart skip a beat. This lady was definitely the most terrifying enemy he had ever met since he came to this world. Even the revived Milos did not possess such terrifying power. That was if his divine power was not included. Speaking of which, in the history of the Amber Sword, even if the timeline was pushed back half a century, the players might not have seen an existence of Gwendolyn's level. Damn it, this is a version change. Brando cursed in his heart. Fortunately, the elapsed needle still had half of its effect left. Brando could feel Modesty and Gwendolyn flying behind him. He did not need to think to know that they were flying towards him. He felt something tighten around his ankle. Black smoke suddenly rose from the humus of the forest. The black smoke formed into countless arms and grabbed at his ankle. It was dark binding. Black magic. Gwendolyn was indeed an expert in necromancy. Brando, it was known that dragons were highly skilled in magic and were not inferior to the Bugis. However, due to their proficiency in melee combat and spitting fire, few people realized that dragons were also excellent sorcerers. But the Dragon Queen did not expect that the pair of black arms formed by her spell to grab Brendel's ankles, but before they could even get close, they let out a scream and strangely disappeared on their own. Don't use magic on him. Magic is ineffective against him. Seeing this, Modesty hurriedly reminded. With Brando's current level of willpower, even the Dragon Queen's spell would not be able to do anything to him. In fact, what he was really afraid of, other than magic containing divine power, were the legendary Super 10-Circle spells that only appeared occasionally. However, the casting time of those 10-Circle spells was too long and tedious, and could not be used at such a juncture. And Modesty had obviously already experienced it before. Randolph was very powerful. When she was chasing Brendel away earlier, she had tried to cast a few spells, but none of them worked. That was why she had to remind Gwendolyn about it. Gwendolyn was slightly taken aback. The Dragon Queen obviously thought that she was going to win. Gwendolyn's slight delay allowed Brando to rush to the entrance to the underground world of Georgandy Ridge. As he expected, the entrance was a huge sinkhole. However, unlike the usual topography, the bottom of the sinkhole was a vertical cave that was carved by nature. The cave was almost straight. Going down, it was dark and deep, giving off the feeling that this passage would lead straight to the depths of hell in Wone's legends. The Roman's hand was held by Brando, and she could not help but gulp at the sight. "Are we going down?" she asked reluctantly, which was rare. More or less. As Brando said so, he had already jumped into the huge sinkhole. After all, Modesty and Gwendolyn did not give him much time, and more importantly, his EXP was still burning. As he jumped, the three ladies, including the elf, Chiara, and Sunny, screamed. Although logic told them that Brando was definitely not jumping into the sinkhole to commit suicide, the feeling of falling rapidly in the pitch-black darkness was definitely too exhilarating. The few of them could feel the whistling of the wind around them, and the scenery around them became blurry. Gradually, from bright to dark, it became very blurry, but they could still feel that they were falling very fast, because the wind was blowing so hard that they couldn't open their eyes. Chiara's voice had almost changed because of the airflow into her mouth. She asked loudly in the wind, "What's down there?" Brando lowered his head and saw that the darkness below had reappeared with specks of light. It felt like looking up at the starry sky, but at this moment, the starry sky appeared under his feet. It was a very strange feeling. He knew that those were plants that could shine in the dark, moss, ferns, or some kind of glowing fungus. As long as one went deep into the ground, such plants were not uncommon. In Georgandy Ridge, there were even whole forests of glowing plants. However, the glowing plants below were obviously not a forest. It would be too shabby to call them shrubs because they were not in the Georgandy Ridge. Big beehive. Brando only said 3 words to Chiara. His voice turned into a strange whimper along with the sound of the wind. At this time, there was a slight darkness above his head, and 2 dragons had appeared at the entrance of the passage. Brando felt that Modesty and Gwendolyn's lines of precepts had been tightly surrounding him. At least within such a short distance, the 2 dragons would never lose sight of him. But he looked at the elapsed needle again. The elapsed needle had been on for nearly half a minute. In addition to the previous waste, the EXP he had lost in such a short time was almost enough to beat the Frostborn guard back to its original state. Suddenly, something flashed in front of his eyes. Brando looked up and found that they had just fallen through a long and narrow pass. This was the place. The long and narrow crack was still there. Brando knew about it because Markilian's hand had once killed a wyvern here by using the terrain. This guild was a rather famous player organization in Cruz, and they had become famous because of it. In this battle, when most players were still below level 30, through the use of reasonable tactics and terrain, they were able to kill a boss that should not have been killed in that era. The spoils of war from that battle laid their foundation in the early stages of the game. And compared to the unlucky wyvern, Modesty and Gwendolyn were much bigger. There was no way they could pass through that crack. Of course, he wasn't naive enough to think that he could trap 2 dragons to death with a single crack. The Margoline's hand was used to deal with wyverns who didn't have any brains, and it had failed several times before it lured them into a trap. With the dragon's intelligence, it would be a joke if they were really trapped by a single crack. Brando only hoped for one thing. That was, in the big beehive, Modesty and Gwendolyn would never be able to move in their dragon form again. The big beehive was the only passage connecting the underground world of Georgandy Ridge and the surface world. The sky here was not as wide as the surface world, and it was even more spacious than the huge underground cavern in Georgandy Ridge. It was some narrow, maze-like beehive-like caverns, similar to the underground karst terrain in Brando's original world, but different from the karst terrain. Unlike the water-soluble topography, the formation of the big hive came from the endless flow of magic wind in the underground world. These underground hot winds originated from the scorching hell. On the surface, it looked like just some underground trade winds with magical colors, but in fact, it represented the erosion of the sea of magic on the world of Vaunt from the west to the top. It was absolutely impossible for a dragon the size of a small mountain to move freely in the terrain formed by erosion. In the form of a human, the strength of a dragon was greatly suppressed. Although its combat strength was basically unaffected, its mobility and perception of the surrounding environment were significantly reduced. It was just like a human transforming into another animal. Most of the time, it would take a long time to adapt. In fact, as long as it wasn't necessary to enter the human world, adult dragons were rarely willing to transform into humans. Only the young dragons who roamed the mortal world would often appear in human form. This was mostly for the purpose of self-protection. Brando looked up and saw the black light flashing on Modesty and Gwendolyn. One of them turned into a human woman wearing a black dress with long black hair that reached her waist. Her eyes were beautiful gold, and she looked very much like a Myrna. As for Gwendolyn's human form, it was very strange. She also turned into a human with long black hair. She was a lady with long hair, but her hair was tied up, and her forehead was embedded with a beautiful purple crystal. If it was not for the different color of the crystal, it would be the same as Ekka's Heart of Calamity that was inserted into Kohua's forehead. If it was not for Brando's strong perception, he would not have noticed the crystal from such a distance. He immediately realized that this was the true appearance of her dragon horn. Brando also knew that there was another person in history who had such a purple crystal. It was a very famous witch. The Witch Empress assistant, Ilufii. Could these two people be the same person? Or was the Witch Empress assistant actually a dragon? Brando immediately shook his head. The Dragon Queen Gwendolyn was a typical dragon born in the last era before the Great Sacred War. She was only slightly older than Alaz, and in the era of the Sacred War, she should be a young dragon like Alaz. It was impossible for her to become the Witch Empress assistant. This thought in his mind. Just as the thought flashed through his mind, silver lines of law surrounded him, and the momentum of their descent suddenly slowed down. This was one of the basic abilities of a powerhouse after elemental activation. Flight. The elapsed needle was still spinning slowly, but Brando did not intend to burn the last bit of Frost Soil Guard's EXP and completely destroy this profession. He decisively flew a distance into the beehive and directly turned off the elapsed needle. At this moment, the strange terrain below the beehive that was riddled with holes finally appeared in front of his eyes. At the same time, after the time acceleration had stopped, Gwendolyn, who was behind him. Modesty and Gwendolyn instantly sped up and crossed the pass in the blink of an eye. When their eyes scanned below, they instantly found Brando. Brando looked back at the two dragons and plunged into the beehive. Below was one of the legendary scariest mazes in the whole of Wonde. Every year, countless confident explorers would lose their way inside and be lost forever. There was no lack of well-known powerhouses among them. Not to mention these natives, even players would get lost and die inside. There were countless of them, and it was important to know that players had the map provided by the system. Of course, that completely three-dimensional map was just slightly dizzying. In general, once one entered the beehive, the probability of getting lost was relatively high, no matter if one was a dragon or a human. There were generally only a few fixed passageways from the underground of Georgandy Ridge to the surface world. This was a shortcut that countless people found in the beehive at the cost of their lives. Ordinary people would not dare to open up another passageway at will. But now, what Brando had to do was to quickly get lost inside. Of course, he had to get the two dragon ladies lost as well. If he got lost, he would just set the coordinates of the Buga people's teleportation gate on the spot, and then let the Shires summon him back, and let the Druids open the teleportation gate to pull Chiara and the others back. And once the two dragon ladies got lost, it would be difficult for them to find their way out in a short time. That was his real purpose. Otherwise, even if he returned to the main group now, Modesty and Gwendolyn would be able to find him in the blink of an eye. Then, wouldn't all his previous efforts be in vain? The only question now was whether Gwendolyn and Modesty would give him the opportunity to do so. As soon as Brando entered the beehive, he immediately felt that the range of his perception had become narrower. First of all, this was a psychological factor of people in a narrow space. Second, after losing the open field of vision, one's perception of one's surroundings would indeed be greatly reduced. But he did not panic, because he knew that this limitation was even more unbearable for Modesty and Gwendolyn. Dragons were known for their eyesight, which was also a common characteristic of most flying creatures. Most of the time, they were used to using their eyesight to search for enemies. Although the lines of law could also be used to sense enemies, the range of the lines of law's perception had also become much closer underground after penetrating the rock layer. In a situation where both sides had become blind, the situation was definitely more favorable for the one who was hiding. But there were exceptions. Just like now, although Brando had already led Chiara and the others into those strange underground holes, he could still feel Gwendolyn's aura of law surrounding him like maggots in a tarsal bone. Her aura was even getting closer, which meant that he was not out of her surveillance range at all. If not for the complex underground terrain, he would have been caught by her long ago. That was the big problem. Although Brando knew that the seven-pole Dragon King was very good at foresight, he did not expect her descendant to be so outstanding in this field. It was really a miscalculation. Now, it seemed that there was no way to escape. He could only think of another way to buy time. This was not a problem for Brando. Since he had chosen this escape route, he would definitely not only arrange for one escape route. As a veteran player, this was a basic quality. When Brando sensed that Gwendolyn's aura was almost within reach, he immediately reached out to greet Chiara and the others. There was a fork in the road ahead, so he decisively took out a cloak from the dimensional space and covered everyone under it. The little elf could not help but cry out in surprise when she saw the cloak. A little elf's cloak. But when she saw everyone staring at her in shock and anger, she realized that it was not the time to speak. She quickly replied in a small voice, feeling wronged. I saw wrongly. Chiara glared at her, but the speaker did not mean it. Brando asked curiously in a low voice, "You have a cloak similar to this one?" The little elf nodded at once. Brando could not help but take a long look at the little lowly. His cloak was the cloak of the Giant King, and it was certainly not the only cloak in the world of Wone that could completely hide one's aura. In fact, there was another cloak. It was a gift from the Dragon King Bahamut to the mortals, the Dragon King's cloak. If Brando remembered correctly, that cloak was in Eltarin. His gaze suddenly fell on a small brooch on the little elf's chest. "What are you looking at?" Chiara noticed Brando's expression and asked in a low voice, somewhat puzzled. Gwendolyn and Modesty were not close yet. Brando hesitated for a moment before answering, "Have you heard of the emblem of nature affinity?" Of course, the seal of the earth, the token of the great sage Eltarin. How could I not have heard of it? Kiara suddenly closed her mouth and looked at the brooch on the little elf's chest in shock. No way. Chapter 955. Before Kiara could finish her sentence, Brando had reached out and covered the mouths of the two little Lolas. Now was not the time to discuss this. The darkness seemed to have returned to silence, and the underground world was dead silent. Kiara and the little elf rolled their eyes in the dark, and a moment later, they heard a rustling sound from the other side of the deep shadows. Then, many squirming shadows appeared on the ground and walls. They were countless rats and insects, and as if they were fleeing for their lives, they scattered in all directions and ran past where Brando and the rest were. The two little Lolas almost screamed when they saw this, and if not for Brando covering their mouths tightly, they would have screamed. The two of them grabbed onto Brando's arm tightly and tried their best to close their eyes, not wanting to see this scene. A layer of goosebumps rose all over their bodies. These low-level creatures instinctively sensed the approaching danger and made such a choice. This meant that the two dragons were coming in their direction, and the dragon's aura they exuded was the most eye-catching light in the darkness. A moment later, everyone realized this. Brando had already pulled the three ladies back into one of the forked paths, and the few of them stayed quietly under the cover of their cloaks. After a moment, two figures appeared from the other side of the darkness. Brando immediately recognized that it was Modesty and Gwendolyn in their human forms, and the others' hearts were in their throats. However, the two dragons did not immediately lunge in their direction. On the contrary, Gwendolyn and Modesty were gradually slowing down. Both of them frowned. Modesty was the first to notice that Brendel and the others had suddenly disappeared from her perception. Her perception was far inferior to Gwendolyn's. Gwendolyn had the dragon's bloodline, and even among the entire dragon race, their ability to foresee things could be considered outstanding. But almost at the same time, Gwendolyn had also lost track of Brando and the rest. She frowned slightly and looked around strangely, and her footsteps slowed down unnaturally. Modesty, of course, noticed this subtle change. She looked at Gwendolyn in disbelief, unable to believe that Brando could escape from under her nose. He ran away, Gwendolyn said flatly, noticing Modesty's gaze. But not far away. I can feel that he should still be nearby. He must have used some kind of power to suddenly disappear from my sight. Is it a teleportation spell? Modesty asked, a little surprised. No, it's not. Gwendolyn shook her head. Teleportation spells will cause the laws of space to vibrate, but she did not feel any magical ripples. It was as if Brando had suddenly disappeared into thin air in front of her. The Dragon Queen frowned slightly and said, I can feel that they haven't left here yet. They must have used something to block my perception. The elapsing needle can't do that, Modesty replied indignantly. That little guy sure has a lot of gadgets. I can't believe he's just a human nobleman, Gwendolyn did not comment. At that moment, she had already seen the fork in the road ahead. When the Dragon Queen's cold, knife-like gaze swept over them, except for Brando, the other three ladies and the pseudo-dragon lady froze as if they had been petrified. Although they knew that there was a layer of cloak between them, they still had the illusion that they had been discovered. In fact, even Brando took a light breath. He certainly knew the effect of the Giant King's cloak, but he was afraid that Gwendolyn would suddenly become suspicious and stay here. That would be troublesome. After all, Bunny's cloak had a duration. Fortunately, after Gwendolyn's gaze swept across the entire long underground cave, she did not stop at any place. She only gave Modesty a look, and then the two entered the fork in the cave, one on the left and one on the right. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. Everyone under the cloak seemed to have understood what it meant to pass a day like a year. The Roman was the first to let out a sigh of relief. As if the long sigh was contagious, the other ladies also let out a sigh of relief one by one. As the only man among them, Brando naturally had to show enough courage and grace. Although he was also very nervous, he only let out a sigh of relief. He gestured to the others, indicating that they should not move first. Giant dragons could sense enemies around them through the aura of the laws they emitted. This perception range was extremely wide. He was estimating the speed of Gwendolyn and Modesty, estimating how long it would take for them to go deep into the beehive. It was not the first time he faced a giant dragon, nor was it the first time he played a game of hide-and-seek with such a boss-level creature. However, this time he did not dare to time it too tightly. After all, this was not a game, and he only had one chance to fail. The key was that he was worried about Gwendolyn's perception that surpassed that of a normal dragon. She had obviously expected that they were still hiding nearby, so how deep into the beehive was still a problem. Because of these reasons, he had to be extra careful and did not immediately take off Bunny's cloak. Of course, he did not plan to use up all of the cloak's duration in one go. After all, in his plan, he would need to use this cloak at least 2 or 3 more times. After he gestured to Kiara and the elf, he quietly began to count the time. He did not expect that his caution would help him a lot. Just as he counted to 10, a black shadow suddenly flashed in the cave, and Gwendolyn walked out again. At that moment, Brando and the others were scared out of their wits, especially Brando. After a moment of relief, he could not help but feel a little anxious. Bunny's cloak still had half of its duration left, but no one knew what Gwendolyn had come back for. Gwendolyn walked around the cave, from one end to the other, as if thinking about something. Then, she walked back to the front of the forked cave and frowned slightly. When Brando saw this, his frown deepened. There was less than a minute left, and this girl still had the leisure to think about life here. Was she trying to kill him? What should he do now? Seeing that the Dragon Queen did not seem to intend to leave, Brando also subconsciously put his hand on the elapsing needle. If the Dragon Queen did not leave, he would have to start the elapsing needle again. However, if he appeared under the Dragon Queen's nose now, it would not be so easy to use the same trick to deceive her next time. He could only hope that the elapsing needle's multiple times acceleration would give the Dragon Queen a gap in her reaction time, so that she would not realize that he had actually appeared from behind her. He held the elapsing needle, hesitating for a moment. To go for it or not, that was the question. If he was alone, with his usual gambler's temper in this environment, he would definitely go for it, but now he had the Roman beside him. 30 seconds left. Brando licked his lips. It was at this time that he saw Gwendolyn suddenly start to walk again. She slowly approached the fork, but this time, she chose the side that Modesty had entered. She wants to find Modesty. Brando thought to himself. This could not be better. He could not help but pray. Go, my dear Dragon Queen. There is nothing here for you to miss. The Dragon Queen seemed to have heard his prayer. She glanced at the cave one last time, and finally walked lightly in the direction where Modesty had disappeared. Brando looked at the Dragon Queen's slow pace, and his heart was a little anxious. There were only 20 seconds left, and there was not enough time. Gwendolyn finally walked into the cave, but as soon as she entered, she immediately stopped, turned around, and looked in Brando's direction. At that moment, Brando was so scared that his heart almost stopped beating. He could clearly feel the Dragon Queen's cold gaze landing on him. She had discovered them. That was impossible. King Bunny's cloak's ability to hide breath was comparable to the will of the mountains and rivers, and the Azure Lance, a level 1 divine artifact. This was its only use. Even William had admitted that he could not see through Bunny's cloak, let alone a dragon. It was just a boss. What was there to worry about? He had seen it many times. She definitely had not discovered them. Most likely, she had suspicions in her heart and wanted to trick them into showing themselves. As if to confirm Brando's guess, the Dragon Queen opened her mouth and said, How long are you going to hide there? Brando instinctively covered the little elf's mouth, lest this somewhat dull little fellow sold them all out. Kiara also kept her mouth shut tight. She was the smartest of all of them, at least that was what she thought. Naturally, it was impossible for her not to see through the other party's little trick. A trace of anger flashed in Gwendolyn's eyes. She stared at these people and said, "Do you think I'm blind? King Bunny's cloak, that little fellow William has invested a lot in you. It seems that you really are here for the azure lance. You said it so righteously before, but your excuse is a little too clumsy. You human nobles have done a lot of bad deeds. How can such an excuse be trusted?" Brando was finally stunned this time. How did she find out? The cloak's duration was still 20 seconds. He could not have miscalculated. Could it be that the Seven Dragons King's ability was so abnormal that it could even ignore a gift from the gods? However, Gwendolyn seemed to have seen through his surprise. She sneered and said, "William was smart all his life, but he was stupid this time. He actually gave Bunny's cloak to you idiots. This cloak was originally an item of the dragon's. It was weaved by the breath of the shadow dragon. The shadow of the shadow dragon only flashes at a certain time every day. This cloak has also perfectly inherited this attribute. You keep holding it up, do you think it can cover your breath forever?" "What do you mean?" Gwendolyn was finally angry. "How long do you plan to hold that rag up? Its duration has long expired." Brendel and the others seemed to be startled by the roar and subconsciously put down their hands. Sure enough, the Bunny cloak in their hands had lost its original mana. But that's not right, the Bunny cloak's duration was not over yet. Brendel simply felt wronged. He calculated very clearly that even now, the Bunny cloak should still have 5 seconds left. He suddenly paused as he sensed a faint presence floating in the air. He suddenly realized that it was Gwendolyn's line of law, the law of death. So, Gwendolyn had been projecting her own ultimate flatlands. Bunny's cloak was also disturbed by this powerful law, causing its duration to be greatly reduced. Damn! Brando finally realized that he had realized it too late. Of course, it was also because Gwendolyn's law power was simply too obscure. If it was a projection of Modesty's level, he would have immediately noticed the anomaly. However, such silent erosion often caused people to neglect the danger, falling into a trap without even knowing it. He could vaguely sense that Gwendolyn's line of law was denser than ever. She must have discovered them early on, and had pretended to walk towards the fork in the road to buy time and seal off the area with her law domain. Brando put his hand down from the elapsing needle in distress. He knew that it was useless now. This place was now within Gwendolyn's law domain, and could be considered her ultimate flatlands. If she did not open up this area, no one would be able to rush out. Back in the valley, she did not have the ability to seal off such a large area in the prime material plane. But here, it was effortless. Brando did not expect that he would shoot himself in the foot. "You and I have nothing to talk about now," Gwendolyn replied coldly. "If you still want to die in one piece, hand over Halran Gaia yourself. Since I'm going to die anyway, why should I make it easier for you?" Brando replied irritably. "That's not the same. Don't forget that you still have your territory. I can kill you, but I might not have the time to go to your little kingdom to vent my anger. You don't want me to waste time going there either, do you?" Gwendolyn replied flatly. It was a blatant threat. Brando's face darkened. He had to admit that she had his Achilles heel. He was silent for a moment, and finally sighed as if he had accepted his fate. "All right, I admit defeat. But can you let them go?" He looked at Roman and the others. Roman was startled, and quickly held his hand tightly. The merchant girl pursed her lips and did not say a word, but her actions had already made her intentions clear. "You." Chiara frowned, as if thinking of a way to escape. It was a difficult problem for her, and she was completely stumped. Only the little elf seemed to be completely scared out of her wits. She stood there like a pillar. Brando did not wait for Gwendolyn to reply. He knew the temperament of dragons, and decisively opened a dimensional space, and reached out to grab something. It was a long nail. When Gwendolyn saw it, her expression changed for the first time. "You actually have something like that?" Brando said that not only did he have it, but he had a lot of it, but he did not have time to talk nonsense now. Gwendolyn had already used the lines of law to seal the area. In other words, this meant that she had pulled Brando and the others into her extreme planes. The moment Brando took out the god-slaying magic breaker all, she knew that things were not good. But the Dragon Queen was not as stupid as Williams, and her reaction was very fast. There was a sudden flash of black light in the underground cave, and Brando saw the black smoke around him receding like flowing water. In the blink of an eye, the Dragon Queen's lines of law had completely disappeared. At this moment, he had no choice but to act. A cold light flashed in his hand, and the magic breaker all pierced into two of Gwendolyn's lines of law. The Dragon Queen groaned. Beings of her level would not be easily injured, but once she was injured, it would not be a small injury. She cut off the connection between the two lines of law and herself as fast as she could to prevent herself from being affected by the god-slaying magic breaker all and completely losing her elemental power. Gwendolyn's decisiveness had saved his life, but lines of law and elemental power were not to be trifled with. They were the foundation of Woan's existence, and the link between life and the world. Although the Dragon Queen's lizard tail had saved his life, it was also equivalent to stabbing a knife into his vitals. Brando had been waiting for this opportunity. As soon as the Dragon Queen was injured, he immediately picked up the elapsing needle again, grabbed Chiara, Roman, and the elf, and ran. He knew that this was his only chance. Although the Dragon Queen was injured, it would not be a problem if she risked her life to keep him here. In fact, Gwendolyn immediately used her actions to prove his guess. The latter was completely enraged at this moment. She never dreamed that Brendel would be able to hurt her, much less severely. This was not the same as the minor injuries that Modesty had suffered before. According to her current losses, it would take at least a long time for her to recover, and for the current situation, it was almost a fatal blow to their plan. Trying to run. The Dragon Queen roared, finally unleashing her full power. In fact, unleashing her full power at this time would greatly affect her injuries, but the furious Gwendolyn could not care less. She immediately threw out a silver light. When Brando saw that halo, he was scared out of his wits. He finally realized that he had gone too far. Damn it, Gwendolyn had used a divine artifact against him. That was the grip of Tiamat, the divine artifact of the Seven Dragons King. He did not expect it to be in Gwendolyn's hands. The key was that this divine artifact was a storage artifact, and Gwendolyn had used this crucial storage on him. Brando did not know if he should say that he was too lucky or unlucky. But at least he understood one thing. That was, he could not run away. The grip of Tiamat was the legendary divine artifact of the Arbitration Tribunal. In the midst of the crew's people, it was described as a sacred artifact used to imprison the gods of sin. Although it was only a legend, using it to imprison a human was really a waste of its power. Brando watched the silver light descend on him, but it was at this moment that a green light flashed in his vision, and he saw a circle of almost the same green halo spread out from the elf's body. Nature Affinity Emblem. Brando immediately knew what it was. P.S. After I uploaded it yesterday, I forgot to post it. I only found out this morning. It's so funny. Full attendance is gone again. Master Chidian kneels to you. This is for today. Touch everyone. Sigh, so annoying. Boo-hoo-hoo, I can't afford to marry a cat girl. Readers, please take pity on me. I feel like my heart is broken. Chapter 956. The Nature Affinity Emblem, or rather, the Seal of the Earth. Brando's understanding of it was limited to the fact that it was a token of Eloranta. This emblem was given by the sage to a few people close to her, including a few great druids in the Ring of the World. Other than that, all the rumors about it in the world of Woned were more like illusory legends. Some said that it was a sacred object similar to the Ring of the Wind Empress. Others said that it was just a symbol with a special meaning, and only had the function of reputation and status. But now it seemed that the power of this brooch-like emblem was definitely beyond any rumors about it. Right in front of Brando, a green light spread out from the elf's body, forming a light shield, pushing the silver light of the grip of Tiamat away from the inside. He now saw that the silver light was actually a chain of light without a physical body, but it was now under the resistance of the Nature Affinity emblem, and was blocked outside the light shield. This scene was very clear. The Nature Affinity emblem was protecting the elf. In the world of Woned, there were many protective items that could be triggered, and among them, there was a very high level that could even actively resurrect, teleport, or temporarily shelter the protector in a demi-plane of another dimension. The protective item that automatically produced a protective shield was actually very low level. But the problem was that this light shield was blocking a real divine artifact, even an ancient object recorded in the myths of the Crew's people, the grip of Tiamat. It could not move an inch outside the light shield produced by the Nature Affinity emblem. In fact, the power displayed by the Nature Affinity emblem was far from simple on the surface. As the green halo spread out, Brando also vaguely felt the vibration of another line of law. This vibration was so familiar to him, because it should be some kind of spatial law. This vibration was very subtle, and when he was still wondering if he had sensed wrongly, the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn opposite him felt it even more clearly. She was anxious. The dramatic change in her expression quickly answered the question in Brando's mind. Why is this thing here? The Dragon Queen cried out in shock. Then, under Brendel's surprised gaze, the Dragon Queen suddenly withdrew the grip of Tiamat's attack. She clearly looked up with some lingering fear. At the same time, an inexplicable power spread out above the beehive. It was calm and steady, but had an inviolable majesty. It was like a pair of calm and simple eyes, looking down at the darkness from above. Everything that happened underground, under this gaze, no one had the heart to resist. Whether it was Brando, who could face Malthus and Gwendolyn without batting an eyelid, or the Dragon Queen herself, Brando instantly understood who was looking at him. There was probably only one person in this world who could make Dragon Queen Gwendolyn reveal such an expression with just one look. Dragon Queen Gwendolyn frowned, showing a vexed and regretful expression. She glared at the little elf, and then at Brando. Her lips moved, but she did not even have the courage to say anything. She turned around and shot into the depths of the cave. By the time Brendel and Chiara reacted, the Dragon Queen had already disappeared into the darkness, leaving only her back view. In just a few moments, she had disappeared without a trace. The dark cavern was abnormally quiet for a moment. The pressure of a dragon, the terrifying deterrence of a divine artifact, and the pressure of impending death, these senses that were real a moment ago were now like an illusion that suddenly disappeared. Brando vaguely understood why Gwendolyn suddenly left. She was not afraid of the Nature Affinity sigil on the little elf, but the message that the Nature Affinity sigil sent to an unknown space. If he guessed correctly, the final destination of the message was the Hall of the World Tree in the Ring of the World, the Sage Elanta. She had never left her residence since the Great Sage War. And it was self-evident who the terrible aura that appeared for a moment belonged to. Gwendolyn's sudden retreat did not mean that she was timid. On the contrary, in Brando's opinion, this choice was very wise and reasonable. She obviously recognized the Nature Affinity sigil on the little elf, and clearly knew the use of the sigil, which was why she had such a big reaction. Brando vaguely guessed the origin of the sigil. It should indeed be a token of Atlanta. But it was not. Because it was a leaf of the World Tree. The Nature Affinity Sigil turned out to be a leaf of the World Tree. Legend has it that the leaves of the World Tree had a permanent connection with its trunk. No matter where they were scattered in the world, the fallen leaves would return to their roots. Where the leaves came from, where they would eventually return to. Brando knew that there was a saying in the game. In the Amber Sword, players were keen to find ways to improve their relationship with those legendary characters. This was because most of the quests related to these NPCs were hidden high-level or even epic quests. But among all the NPCs, the most difficult to approach and figure out was undoubtedly the sage Atlanta. Atlanta's reputation did not need to be mentioned. All the players in Woned knew her. If there was a human in this world, whether it was the Silver Folk or the Black Iron Folk, if this person could be called the top of the world, then she must be Atlanta. Whether in the early or late stages of the game, there were countless people looking for ways to get close to the sage. But without exception, they all failed. In fact, ever since the Great Holy War, Sage Atlanta had lived in the center of the Ring of the World, the courtyard of the World Tree. She had never stepped out of there. Except for the sage's star that shone in the night sky as proof that she was still alive, no one had seen the sage for 1,000 years. But the wild elves could not and would not put the sage under house arrest, so the only credible reason was that the sage had sealed herself away. But did she really not care about the outside world? The players guessed that this might not be the case. Otherwise, the druids of the Ring of the World would not have made their move at the right time in the battle against Hattie the Head Wolf in Chapter 4. Although the Great Sage still did not show up in the end, everyone was guessing whether the Great Sage had secretly participated in that tragic war. Now it seemed. The answer was yes. The reason was actually the leaves of the World Tree. These leaves of the World Tree were the eyes of the sage Atlanta. There may not be many of them in the world, but each leaf was kept by the people closest to Atlanta. On the one hand, the sage protected these people, and on the other hand, she observed the world through these people. Although he did not understand why she did this, Brando was almost certain. Who was this little elf in front of him? She could not be a druid. So she must have something to do with the wild elven royal family. While he was thinking about this problem, the voice of the Wind Empress Saint Tossel rang in his mind. Brando. The Wind Empress. Brando was slightly startled, and then he understood why the Wind Empress, who had been appearing and disappearing unpredictably recently, suddenly appeared. It was obvious that she also felt the familiar aura. To them, the sage was just an unreachable existence, but to the Wind Empress who was stored in the Ring of the Wind Empress, to the noble soul, she was once her closest comrade, an old friend of hers. Did you feel it, the Wind Empress? Brando asked. You guessed right, it is indeed her, Saint Tossel replied. She also sensed my existence. Brando was slightly startled. He had not considered this matter, but since Atlanta had sensed the existence of the Wind Empress, she should have noticed him as well. Being noticed by a sage, he was not sure whether it was a good or bad thing for a while. After all, in the last game's history, no player had been able to do such a thing. Such an opportunity was a dream for the players, but they would never have thought that the opportunity would be in the Ring of the Wind Empress and the emblem of nature's affinity. Moreover, the existence of either of these two alone would probably not trigger this plot. This was a rare opportunity, but for this moment, it might not be a good thing for Brando. The higher the level of the existence, the greater the trouble behind it, in addition to the benefits. According to the words of the game, this mission would probably be very difficult. However, Brando did not think about it for the time being. In any case, Atlanta would not be able to come to him for a while. She had indeed helped him scare Gwendolyn away, at least solving his urgent problem. Moreover, the Wind Empress had taken the initiative to come to him, probably to give him some advice. After all, even when facing the Dragon Queen, the sage did not bother to pay attention to him. In theory, she was not Brando's nanny, but the latter's teacher. Therefore, she could teach Brando knowledge, but she would never protect him at such a time. Although Brando sometimes felt that this statement was a little annoying, anyone would hope to have a sage to give them a hand at any time. Whether it was from her rich experience or practical ability, he understood her painstaking efforts after all. Of course, the Elf Queen would not always remain silent and watch Brando's drama unfold. When the right time came, she would always open her mouth to remind her favorite pupil. She did notice you, but not because of my existence. Alanta was also aware of the secret of the Ring of the Wind Empress. It was not even a secret to her. As for the reason why she noticed you, I'm afraid I don't need to say more. Saint Tassol said to Brando. What reason? As soon as Brando opened his mouth, he suddenly realized that he had asked a stupid question, but he could not help but frown. She saw through it. More or less. After all, he and we are old rivals. We are all very sensitive to his heritage. Saint Tassol replied. Brando's expression changed. Although Saint Tassol's attitude towards Odin made him have some different guesses about the relationship between the four sages and the Dark Dragon. In the general historical definition, the relationship between the four sages and the Dark Dragon was naturally irreconcilable, but it turned out that it might not be that bad. Come to think of it, the four sages were after all Tumen students. As for their relationship with the Dark Dragon, their relationship with the Dark Dragon might not be as bad as what the official said. Now it seemed that the dispute between the two sides was mostly due to morality, and not personal dislike. However, the four sages were after all four different individuals. Saint Tassol's opinion could not represent the others. Legend has it that Gretel was the most radical of the four, and Alanta's character was the most tolerant. The problem was that 1,000 years later, who could say for sure? If anyone could say for sure, it was estimated. Only this old comrade of the great sage could do it. Therefore, Brando humbly asked the Elf Queen, his teacher, for advice. What does Lady Alanta think? She wouldn't come and kill your only student, right? Saint Tassol smiled slightly, thinking that Brando's statement was somewhat interesting. Not to that extent, but if it was a while ago, I'm afraid it would be hard to say. Our deaths were a great blow to Sister Alanta, and I'm afraid she wouldn't let you go at that time. But now, after 1,000 years, our views are already different from when we were young. She didn't say anything to me just now. For you and me, her only student, she naturally wouldn't go too far. Brando breathed a sigh of relief, then replied, but there must be something else, right? Of course, he knew that even if the Wind Empress was in a particularly good mood today, she wouldn't come to him for so much nonsense for no reason. Saint Tassol nodded. She saw Gwendolen. That dragon. Brando was slightly stunned. Didn't you see it too? I'm different from her, Saint Tassol replied snappily. Sister Alanta was able to live until now because of the agreement between the four of us. I'm afraid I don't need to say more about her mission. You should be able to guess it. She has monitored this world for 1,000 years, and she knows better than me what has happened in this world in the past 1,000 years. Gwendolen and the appearance of Georgandy Ridge, in my opinion, are at most a little strange, but in her opinion, it's different. What's different about it? Brando was a little curious. This was something he had always wanted to know, but he didn't expect to get an answer from this sage. The Elf Queen shook her head. I can't say for sure. After all, we didn't communicate directly, but I can feel some of her thoughts. I'm afraid this matter has something to do with you, Brando. It has something to do with me. Brando frowned slightly. The first thing he thought of was his grandfather. At present, it seemed that the only connection between Gwendolen and himself was this mysterious grandfather. In addition, there was the Holy War. Erewhon, Georgandy Ridge, and Cruz, the three countries that were originally independent of each other, were now completely entangled because of this holy war. No. The only connection between Erewhon and this holy war fell on him, which could be regarded as a place related to him. What else was there? Scarlet. Or Her Majesty the Queen herself? Brando shook his head. There were too many clues, and he wanted to do something else. Before, Kiera told him that Gwendolyn was on the side of the Silver Queen. The situation was too critical before, and he didn't have time to investigate it in detail. But now that he thought about it, the problem was too big. On one hand, it represented Georgandy Ridge, and on the other hand, it was the supreme of the Empire, that Rogers and the others had been, the judgment of looking for Her Majesty the Queen. This joke was a little too big. What should I do? Brando couldn't figure it out, so he simply didn't think about it and asked directly. This was a good habit of his, to put it simply, he was lazy. The Wind Empress glared at her good student and said, "This is also what Elaranto wants you to help with. The situation in the Cruz Empire is very unusual, and it seems that it has somewhat exceeded her expectations." She said that the appearance of Gwendolyn and the others alarmed her. Brando suddenly thought of something. He interrupted the Wind Empress and said, "Does the sage also want me to inform the dragons?" How did you guess?" "Damn," Brando replied in a bad mood, "is there a need to guess? She must know about the agreement between the dragons and the Cruz Empire. This agreement is hidden from me, Martha above." The Wind Empress smiled slightly and said, "There's one more thing, that little girl." Hearing this, Brando was slightly startled. In fact, he didn't need the elf to remind him. He also remembered the most important problem at hand. Brando looked at the little elf who was standing uneasily beside Kiera. The latter was like a child who had done something wrong. She lowered her head and twisted the corner of her clothes with her hands, not even daring to look at them. When Brando saw her like this, he couldn't help but feel angry and amused at the same time. She was obviously pretending. She was obviously acting like that before, but now she immediately turned into a lady. The young lady. Who would believe that? He didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he asked, "Young lady, since we're already here, shouldn't you at least introduce yourself?" I'm a little elf." The little elf trembled and replied weakly. But unfortunately, this answer obviously couldn't satisfy Brando. "PS, I wrote too late. I dragged it out until now. I'm so sleepy. I'm going to sleep after posting this chapter. Also, I'll say goodnight to everyone." Chapter 957. When Brando first met Gwendolyn in the Silver Valley, the Georgandy Ridge Army's offensive did not stop for even a moment. After losing contact with Vargas, Nephiel and Taris were declared lost one after another. It was then that Cruz finally figured out who their enemy was, the King of the Lizards, Grey Eyes Moksha. Moksha commanded his army to march northward and swept through the Merlin area to the north of the Bear Lake. Wherever they passed, the remaining resistance forces in Ansloa's area collapsed one after another. At this time, Georgandy Ridge's intentions were as clear as day. It was obvious that their target was Asaf. Once Asaf was lost, the Empire would face the danger of losing the Evergreen Corridor and thus being isolated from the wilderness of the Four Territories. It was only at this moment that the people of the Empire who had been beaten senseless reacted. The lords and local legions quickly mobilized, waiting for Her Majesty's order to provide support. The White Legion advanced southward to the vicinity of the Evergreen Corridor, ready to reinforce the most important lifeline of the Empire at any time. But it was easier said than done to turn the situation around. In the previous few attacks, some people had even observed the existence of dragons, and the news from Rokizi had confirmed this. At least 2 of the 5 underground kings had participated in this battle, and this news had shaken the entire empire. It was as if the empire had never faced such a dangerous situation since the last war. From the politicians and soldiers to the commoners, almost everyone was inquiring about this sudden war from various sources. The nobles were concerned about what kind of harm this war would bring to their interests, while the commoners were worried about whether the flames of war would spread uncontrollably and drag them into the quagmire of war. At this moment, Ansloa's battle had plunged the southern part of the empire into a confusing fog. From the Violet Valley to the Metz region in the north of the sublime inland sea, from Cloak Bay to Bangor, countless eyes were focused on this place through various means. Everyone was waiting anxiously for news from Asgard. But there were always people who thought further. What will happen if Asaf is lost? The one who asked the question was a little girl with big, sparkling blue eyes and shoulder-length blonde hair. She was wearing a princess dress and sitting on a chair with her hands folded on top of her dress. She was obviously a well-educated noble lady. The little girl was looking up at Madame Merrier, their history and nobility teacher. Not far away, Vahina was sitting on a high chair, looking out of the window absent-mindedly. It was a floor-to-ceiling arched window. Outside the window was the scenery of Fort Ravolf in winter. The forest still had a touch of dark green color, but above the canopy was set against the snow-capped peaks. Mihodefen was a basin surrounded by plains and hills in the south of the snow-capped mountains of Ludwig. The melting snow converged into a river to form a fertile land. When winter passed and spring came, the land would be covered with flowers. The country bumpkins from the enrich area in the east called it the land of flowers in spring. The cold wind from the eastern glaciers made Grisha stay in the snow all year round. In comparison, the fertile land in the south was warmer. That was how it got its name, the land of flowers and leaves. That was the name of the land. Before the year of the flower, his master was the noble Brook, who died of typhoid fever in the year of the ear of wheat. After that, Duke Helix, who is now known as the Gloomy Duke, inherited the title of Duke and became the actual owner of this land. The Duke was not an ascetic, but he had few children. He only had 2 sons, the eldest of whom died in the last war. After his 2 sons, he only had a pair of granddaughters. Vahina glanced enviously at her carefree sister. In her heart, she had already mercilessly despised the other party's stupid question. However, this kind of disdain stemmed from the doting heart of an elder sister towards her younger sister, so she didn't show it on her face. The 2 sisters had always been on good terms with each other. Elise was known as the most obedient little angel in the flower leaf territory, while Faina's temper was something that Brendel had personally experienced. She had always been lawless outside the circle of trade winds and committed crimes together with her friends in the imperial capital. It was only after she returned from the loop of trade winds that she became a little more ladylike, and Duke Helix had to thank the heavens for that. However, what she did during this period of time was to compile her adventures into a book after she returned to the territory. She wanted to bring it to Rushta in the future to show off. Of course, before that, her only sister was already familiar with these stories. The little girl, who was still in an ignorant period, didn't feel bored at all. Instead, she was full of admiration for her sister. So much so that the latter was also full of longing for the outside world. However, she wasn't as daring as her sister. After Elise asked that question, the hall was silent for a moment. Madame Merrier seemed to be thinking about the question as well, not in a practical sense, but purely from an academic point of view. Therefore, she was not affected by the current situation of the empire. She adjusted her glasses and thought for a moment before answering. From a purely military point of view, the empire is likely to lose the Evergreen Isle. However, this blow to the empire is far more symbolic than practical. Even if the empire loses the Evergreen Isle, they can still support the battlefield in the wilderness of 4 territories from Flower Leaf Domain. This is a rare opportunity for the Grand Duke. If not for the enmity with Farnesane back then, with Flower Leaf Domain's geographical location, it is not inferior to the Evergreen Isle at all. This lady's interests were closely related to the Flower Leaf territory. She was still brooding over the fact that the Flower Leaf territory's commerce had declined due to the last Holy War. As soon as she talked about this matter, she immediately began to talk non-stop. Elise listened with great interest, while Vahina was already bored to death. She had listened to the same thing a few hundred times already, and her ears were getting calluses from listening to it. More importantly, she was not in the mood to listen to these things at all. The reason for all of this was the letter her father's butler handed to her the night before. The letter came from the imperial capital of Rushta. Like many other major families in the empire, the House of Kirk had many informants and connections in the center of the empire's power. Be it during critical times or on normal days, there would be many letters between these families and their informants and connections. These letters were no longer a secret in the empire, but the one in Vahina's hands was different. There were some secret markings on the letter of the ancient family, and these markings could only indicate that the letter came from an important member of the family. For example, Duke Helix and Vahina's father, Count Effie, who was currently in the imperial capital. The content of the letter was simple. It only said that there were some troubles in the imperial capital and that they would only be able to return to their territory a little later. However, it was this letter that aroused Vahina's suspicions. Currently, there were no male members in the family. Based on her grandfather's and father's personalities, it was impossible for them to send such a formal letter to inform her. This was something that had never happened before, so she was alarmed. For the past week, she had been trying to get information from the capital through her butler, Elliot. However, something strange happened. The family's informants in Rusta seemed to have vanished into thin air. She couldn't get in touch with any of them. The news about her grandfather and father were also half-truths. Some said that Duke Helix was still living in the Tulip Mansion in the imperial capital, but the informants Elliot sent out said that the news was false. The Duke and the Count had left 2 weeks ago. The conflicting news hung over Vahina like a dark cloud. She was starting to regret that she did not listen to her grandfather's instructions and seriously participate in the daily affairs of the fief. Now that she had to start all over again without anyone to rely on, she felt like she was in the dark. The last batch of people should be back soon, Vahina thought to herself. The young lady felt as if she was sitting on pins and needles as she thought to herself. The incessant Madame Marrier couldn't help but become even more hateful in her eyes. This hateful old maid. Vahina cursed under her breath. But it was a pity that Madame Marrier's status in the fief was high. In the past, her grandfather, Duke Helix, would never do anything to her just because of her slanderous words. Most of the time, she would be punished by confinement, which was a common occurrence for Vahina. But now, Vahina could be said to be the one in charge of the House of Flowers, but she did not have the mood to retaliate. Just as she was about to fall asleep, a long-awaited knock came from outside the hall. Madame Marrier stopped and glared at Vahina sternly. Vahina hurriedly gestured apologetically, jumped off the chair, and ran out of the door. She did not tell anyone about what happened in the past week and a half, not even Elise. At least the noble lady knew what it meant. The butler of the castle had been waiting outside for a long time. Vahina saw her father's trusted aide and hurriedly asked, "How is it, Mr. Elliot? Is there any news about my grandfather and my father?" She was halfway through her question when she suddenly shut her mouth. That was because she saw the terrible expression on her father's face. It was the first time she saw such an expression on his poker face. Without any warning, the princess of the House of Flowers had a bad feeling. She hesitated for a moment before asking, "Butler Elliot, did something happen to my grandfather?" Elliot nodded stiffly. "Milady, something happened in the imperial capital. I think you should be prepared." "What the hell happened?" Vahina's face turned pale as if she had been struck by a rod. She could not help but ask with some fear, "Did my father and grandfather—" "You're overthinking it, milady," Elliot quickly explained, realizing that the young mistress had misunderstood. "The Duke and the Count should be safe for now, but a few days ago, Her Majesty the Queen issued an order to put them under house arrest." "Put them under house arrest?" Vahina was slightly stunned. She seemed to be relieved, but at the same time she asked in confusion, "Why?" She knew that ever since Her Majesty the Queen ascended to the throne, her relationship with the House of Kirk had never been good. However, it was not so bad that she would put a duke under house arrest. What did this mean? It meant that the imperial family had publicly broken ties with a powerful family. She believed that no matter if it was the Queen or the entire empire, this was something that they didn't want to see. Her Majesty the Queen believes that the Duke and the Count have betrayed the Empire. Elliot stammered. Betrayed the Empire? Vahina almost jumped out of her seat. What kind of joke is that woman playing? How is that possible? Elliot did not dare to answer because it was too disgraceful. Fortunately, there were no outsiders here. He carefully looked around before reminding his young mistress, "Please be careful with your words, milady. The Duke and the Count have been put under house arrest in the imperial capital. Her Majesty the Queen will definitely make a move on us before this news spreads. You have to make a decision." Vahina was stunned. She had to make a decision, but what decision could she make? The only person she could rely on right now was her teacher, Veronica. However, the problem was that Veronica had been put under house arrest because of her previous trip to Erewhon. Vahina couldn't help but feel isolated and helpless after hearing Elliot's words. Her mind was in a mess, and she couldn't help but speak to her father's butler. "I understand, Elliot. Let me be alone for a while. I'll tell you what to do later." The old butler seemed to have seen through his young mistress's predicament, but he didn't expose her. He only nodded and replied, "Call me if you need anything." Then, he turned around and left. Vahina was left standing by the door in a mess. Never in her wildest dreams did she imagine that her grandfather and father's ordinary trip to the imperial capital would turn out like this. She didn't know if it was her or Her Majesty the Queen who had gone mad. Under normal circumstances, even if her grandfather and father had really betrayed the empire, the imperial family wouldn't have dealt with them so carelessly. After all, the impact of this matter was too great. No matter how she looked at it, there was another reason for Her Majesty's actions. But the key was that she couldn't figure out what the problem was. If only that guy was here. He must know what happened. It seems like there's nothing we can hide from him. Vahina couldn't help but mutter to herself. She stood by the door for a moment and was about to turn around and inform Elise about this matter. Now that things had come to this, she knew that she couldn't hide it any longer. If she wasn't careful, the House of Kirk would be doomed eternally. Of course, it was the same for Her Majesty the Queen. That was what Vahina couldn't understand. She couldn't understand why the Queen of the Empire seemed to have gone mad all of a sudden. It was at this moment that a guard ran in from outside. The guard was slightly startled when he saw Vahina. He probably didn't expect her to stand by the door in a daze. "Milady, there's a group of knights outside." "A group of knights?" "No, to be precise, it's a group of knights and another person." The guard quickly explained. "What group of knights and another person?" Vahina snapped. "I'll give you a chance to explain yourself. Otherwise, I'll throw you into the dungeon." That guard was startled. Obviously, he had not expected that he would be enraged by the Princess of Flower Leaf territory. He hurriedly explained cautiously, "There are two groups of people outside the door. One group seems to be the knights of the town, while the other group only has one person, who seems to be a messenger." "Knight?" Vahina's heart skipped a beat. The so-called knight in town was actually the knight of the inner court. It was an open secret that these knights were stationed in the private territories of the nobles. In more remote places, the local lords might only know that there were such people in their own territories, but not necessarily know who they were. But in a territory like Flower Leaf, the royal family had no choice but to care about the attitude of the various dukes. Therefore, the knight stationed here was mostly semi-public. And as the Watchers, the relationship between the Watchers and the Watchers would naturally not be harmonious. Most likely, they wouldn't come for anything good. Vahina immediately connected the dots with Elliot's words. She frowned and was about to refuse when she stopped and asked, "Is the messenger with them?" "Yes." The guard replied honestly. He couldn't help but rejoice that this little she-devil princess was kind enough to not throw him into the pitch-black dungeon below the castle. This was no laughing matter. Last time, there was a maidservant who was slightly displeased by this young lady and was thrown into the dungeon for several days. The maidservant was so scared that she was still a little neurotic to this day. "Is he our messenger?" Vahina asked again. The guard shook his head. "I don't think so. He said he's from Enslova." "I think he's a liar. That place has long been sealed." "Shut up," Vahina coldly cut him off. "I didn't ask you that. You said he's from Enslova." The guard nodded. Chapter 958. Did you ask who he was delivering the letter for? I did, and he said it was a count. The guard answered cautiously. Did he say who he was delivering the letter to? My father, my grandfather, or me? Vahina continued. The guard hesitated for a moment, but did not answer directly. What's wrong? Vahina finally noticed the guard's abnormality and could not help but frown. What are you afraid of? He said that the count said that the letter was to be delivered to a bad-tempered young lady from the circle of envelopes. The guard stuttered. Why did it sound like the bad-tempered young lady was referring to the one in front of him? There were two young ladies in Fort Ravov, but one of them was a gentle little angel known far and wide, and the other. The guard quickly shook his head, feeling that he was not far from the dungeon. What he did not expect was that Vahina's blue eyes lit up instead of getting angry. Really? He really said that? It's over, the guard thought. The young lady is so angry that she has lost her mind. Someone is going to be in trouble next, and it's not going to be the messenger. The messenger is just an explorer who happened to be passing by, and the count is far away. The one who's going to be in trouble is himself. The guard could not help but frown and nod. That's right, young lady. I didn't dare to say a single word. I didn't ask you if you were talking too much. Are you going to add fuel to the fire? Where's the letter? Vahina shrugged and replied in annoyance. The guard quickly took out the letter. It had obviously been through a long journey and was not well preserved. The surface of the letter was wrinkled, and there was a wax seal on it. There was an imprint of a morning star and a new moon on it. Vahina immediately recognized it as the imprint of Erwin's envoy, and her eyes lit up again. How did it end up like this? She asked. Because the road to Anslois is closed, said the guard, and it is said that the messenger has had some trouble coming from there. It was only then that Vahina remembered the war in the south of the empire. Separated by the evergreen corridor, it seemed to be in another world. The fact that the letter could reach here meant that it had been sent before the war. Otherwise, Ankloa would have been unable to enter and leave by now. She nodded to herself and opened the letter. The guard at the side was trembling with fear as he waited for his final decision. He thought that since the count dared to call her young miss with a bad temper, he was most likely not a friend. Then the contents of the letter were self-evident. He wondered how angry this young miss would be after reading the letter. Last time, the maid who made a mistake was only locked up for a few days, but he felt that this time, he might have to live in there for the rest of his life. He did not expect Vahina to finish reading the letter so quickly. It was not a long letter, only a few sentences long. She then smiled, thinking that the bastard was really despicable. Instead of helping her, he only wanted to entrust her with a task. She cursed in her heart, and then said to the guard in a good mood, "Is the messenger still here?" The guard was waiting for his inevitable misfortune. As a member of the castle, he knew the temper of this young lady too well. Therefore, he didn't take any chances. At this moment, he was muddle-headed and didn't understand. He just nodded honestly and said, "He's still outside." "Very well, you may leave. Don't forget to reward the messenger." What? What? What are you daydreaming about? Vahina frowned at the servant. No. Nothing. I mean, the guard asked in surprise, "Young miss, do you need a reply?" A reply. This reminded Vahina of something. Even though she often had many admirers in the imperial capital writing her letters, she never had to consider replying to them. There were also some letters that came from the imperial capital's informants or nobles that she had close relationships with. That was why Vahina's impression of letters was that there was no need for her to reply to them. A reply, she thought. However, she suddenly remembered the group of knights outside the castle, and a dark cloud rose in her heart. Better to wait. "Oh, there's no need," Vahina replied. For some reason, she did not want others to know about her relationship with Brando. The guard was slightly startled. He thought that if that fellow was an enemy of this young lady, then she would at least be furious. If not, she would at least believe him. What did she mean by that? Oh. It was really hard to figure out. For a moment, he only felt that the young miss in front of him had become unfathomable. It was rumored that she had changed into a different person after returning from the loop of trade winds, and now it seemed that it was true. However, he did not dare to speak out of turn. That unlucky maid was a lesson to be learned from. Hearing Vahina's order, he hurriedly left as if he had been pardoned from a great crime. He was afraid that the young miss would remember what happened in the dungeon. That would be a great loss. After the guard left, Vahina hesitated. That bastard wants me to help him investigate teacher's situation in the imperial capital, but what should I do? She muttered to herself, "It's not just teacher, even grandfather and my father are under house arrest. If possible, I want to know what happened in the imperial capital too." That's right. A strange light suddenly flashed through her starry eyes. The Erezico family. I should have thought of them long ago. That bastard isn't close to them, but our family's relationship with them is pretty good. Let's do that. The young miss nodded and opened the door confidently. Then, she walked in. As for the knight outside the castle, she had already made up her mind to ignore them. The Flower Leaf Dukedom still had some autonomy in the Cruz Empire. Leaving aside the chaotic reaction of the people in Fort Warwolf, after comforting her only sister, Vahina immediately wrote a letter to the Loison domain in the Evergreen Corridor. Ever since Veronica was placed under house arrest, the daily affairs of the Erezico family had fallen on her brother, Count Rodney. Rodney was currently acting as the Queen's special envoy in Jordan City, south of the Violet Valley, working together with Count Wagner of the White Legion. Of course, it sounded ridiculous for the commander of the Azure Legion to act as the Queen's special envoy, but the nobles knew that this was only the royal family's way of appeasing the Erezico family. In fact, most people believed that the Queen's punishment of Veronica was just a show of her attitude. Everyone knew how important this goddess of war was to the empire. She wouldn't stay in the imperial capital for too long at this time. As for Count Rodney himself, he might have thought the same, or he might have other thoughts. However, the Count's reputation for being a foppish and weak person had long been known. Therefore, not many people cared about the opinion of this small fry of the Erezico family. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that Count Rodney, the only brother of the empire's goddess of war Veronica and the heir of the Erezico family, was a small fry. This was because the Erezico family was too famous in the empire and everyone in the family was a hero. Veronica's grandfather, the Grand Duke of the Tulip family, was once the founder of the Azure Legion. Before his time, the empire only had 3 legions, and it was this Grand Duke who single-handedly created the Azure Legion. At the same time, he was also one of the most famous sword saints in the previous generation of the empire. Half of the swordsmanship that Veronica practiced was created by him. It was from him that the ancient Erezico family returned to the center of glory and power. As for Veronica's father, he was the famous dictator Lambert. This person's reputation in Fanzin was even greater than his reputation in the empire. If there was anyone in the past 300 years who could make the Greyhues Knight Regiment flee and cry for their parents, then it would be this Grand Duke. In his time, the empire's emperor had once called this place the Great Wall of the Northern Empire. Since then, the Cruz family had never taken advantage of the Fanzin family. Not to mention, in the past 30 years, the Greyhues family had also produced a genius general, Lion Roan. Under such a contrast, the people of the empire, especially the people of the Northern Empire, missed this Grand Duke even more. As for this generation of the family, needless to say, there was naturally the famous Veronica. The title of the empire's goddess of war came from the Hazel people, and almost everyone regarded her as Lambert's successor. If it wasn't for the emergence of the sword Saint Darius more than a decade ago, who overshadowed almost everyone in the same generation, perhaps she would have become the empire's rising star when she was still young in that era. Compared to these elders and his even more powerful sister, Count Rodney's reputation was not as prominent. Although in all fairness, as a descendant of a large family, this count was still considered above average in the empire's noble circle. At least during this period of time, the Erezico family did not cause any trouble in his hands. On the contrary, with the queen's favoritism, everyone was surprised to find that this count's relationship with the imperial family seemed to have improved by a step. At this moment, the count was even more dedicated to his task at hand, to the point that his enthusiasm seemed a little excessive in the eyes of others. Whether it was the queen or the White Legion, it was an obvious fact that a person from the Erezico family could not be allowed to interfere with the Legion's affairs. This Count Rodney was perhaps overly optimistic about his situation. This was what most people secretly thought. In the imperial capital, there was even a saying of carefree idiots. Count Rodney himself had heard of this saying and did not feel the slightest bit embarrassed. Instead, he only laughed disdainfully. A bunch of useless idiots. This was the Count's evaluation of Rushta's muddle-headed fools. At this moment, no one knew better than him the importance of his position. The so-called cooperating with Count Wagner was just an excuse on the surface. In fact, it should be the other way around. He was not only here to monitor the movements of the Evergreen Corridor. In fact, very few people in the imperial capital knew better than him what was happening on Ensloa's end. However, he carefully maintained this small sense of superiority and did not show it on his face. In order to satisfy those idiots in the imperial capital, he had to play the role of an idiot for Her Majesty for a while longer. This was nothing compared to the actual benefits he would gain. But at that moment, Rodney was a little annoyed. He frowned and stared at the man who was wrapped in a long cloak. He remembered that he had told him many times that it was better for this man to send an agent to contact him. It seemed that these guys from the underground of Georgandy Ridge couldn't trust anyone other than himself and insisted that Rodney go personally. However, this was the White Legion's territory after all. If those people found out that their enemies were roaming around within their territory and contacted him, it would be fun. When he thought about the risks involved, he couldn't help but feel annoyed. The key point was that he didn't know Count Wagner's position in this matter. Apart from Her Majesty herself, there weren't many outsiders who knew what kind of people Her Majesty had. He didn't dare to mess this up. No one knew better than him how big the implications of this matter were. It was precisely because of this that Rodney had to suppress his anger. I don't care how many times I've reminded you, but I hope this is the last time. Time is limited. What's the situation on Enslowa's end? How long do I have to wait for that person? Count, the mysterious man's attitude was very respectful, and he didn't seem angry at Rodney's rudeness at all. However, his voice was a little hoarse. I understand your concerns, but this time, I'm going personally because the situation has changed. There were some problems with our operation. That damn dwarf messed up everything and even caused the death of Lady Shagos. But fortunately, the outcome didn't change. Now, Her Majesty the Dragon Queen hopes that you can immediately return to Lust Tower and relay this information to Her Majesty the Queen. Rodney was slightly taken aback. He was about to flare up, but when he heard the words Dragon Queen, he restrained himself. Of course, he knew what kind of existence Her Majesty was in the Empire. Return to the Imperial capital. Rodney knitted his brows. He instinctively felt that he didn't want to return to that place. He knew better than anyone that it was a terrifying vortex that could silently devour everyone at any time. Although he was personally involved in this matter, he wasn't a fool. He had long guessed that Her Majesty the Queen wanted to rope him in because she hoped that he could stabilize the Azure Legion. Only his sister, who didn't know much about politics, thought that this was limited to the scope of the political struggle within the Empire. He saw the changes in Her Majesty the Queen more clearly than anyone else, but he knew that there was someone else who saw it more clearly than him, Duke Helix of the Flowerleaf territory. It was a pity that he made the wrong choice. After listening to the mysterious man's words, he didn't comment and only nodded slightly. I understand. I'll leave immediately. No, the mysterious man stopped him. It's best if you wait a little longer. What? Rodney frowned. His respect for the Dragon Queen didn't extend to these insignificant people. The other party had angered him time and time again, so he naturally wouldn't be stingy to let these people know the consequences of angering him. The mysterious man seemed to sense Rodney's anger and hurriedly explained, Lord Rodney, there's no need to doubt me. I'm doing this for your own good. According to what I know, it won't be long before a letter is delivered to you. A letter? Rodney was startled. I'm afraid it's a letter from Fort Ravov, my lord. The Count's eyes lit up. The news of the Duke of Flowerleaf's capture has already been released. The mysterious man nodded. I understand. I'll go see that young miss. Her Majesty the Queen wants me to bring her to the Imperial capital? Rodney asked. I'm not sure, but when the time comes, you can ask the Dragon Queen personally. The mysterious man replied with a hoarse voice. These damned lizard men, bringing up the Dragon Queen again. Rodney gritted his teeth and nodded in the end. He knew that since the Queen had already released this news, it wouldn't be long before she made her move. At this time, it would be better if he returned to that damned place a day later. He wouldn't have any objections. I just don't know what's the situation in the Imperial capital now. He thought to himself. Thinking of this, he raised his head and stared at the mysterious man in front of him. Mr. Sharix, do you have anything else to say? Of course not, unless my lord wants me to stay for tea. The mysterious man chuckled and replied with a hoarse voice. Rodney couldn't wait for the mysterious man to die immediately. He even wanted him to stay for tea. If it weren't for the Queen, he wouldn't have bothered to stay with these smelly fellows. He replied in a bad mood, Mr. Sharix, you're fine, but I still have one more thing. There's Erwin's envoy in Enslova. I'd like to ask where they went. It seems that ever since Vargas fell, there's been no news of them. Didn't you notice them? Hearing this question, the mysterious man who had always been calm suddenly froze. What's wrong? Rodney obviously noticed this subtle movement. That's what I forgot to say. Sorry. The mysterious man coughed awkwardly. Erwin's envoy is probably on their way to Lone Port. What? Chapter 959. The starry night was silent, and the forest was silent. Two shadows flew across the forest, one after the other, and landed on the grass under the moonlight. The one in front was Gwendolen, the Dragon Queen, who looked like a noblewoman. Behind her was Modesty. The latter seemed to want to ask something, but when she saw Gwendolen's stern face, she swallowed the words that were on the tip of her tongue. The Dragon Queen noticed the subtle change in her expression, and she said, "Say what you want to say. Are you afraid that I will eat you, like those mortals?" Modesty blushed and was a little annoyed. Of course, she was not afraid of being eaten. She was afraid of the Dragon Queen because the Dragon Queen was stronger than her, but this was a fact that she was too proud to say. Modesty was annoyed by Gwendolen's straightforwardness, but she had to answer, "I just want to ask, why did you let them go?" "Because I felt the presence of someone, and I was afraid of attracting her attention," Gwendolen replied, "so I had to let those little mice go." "Who?" "Atlanta." Modesty was shocked and shrieked, "How could it be her? Isn't that woman still in the court of the World Tree? That elf has the leaves of the World Tree on her. Atlanta has always been monitoring this world through her flowers and plants. When I used the grip of Tiamat, she happened to be alerted. Damn it, did she find out about us? I'm not sure, but don't take any chances. From now on, we have to deal with the mess at Ansloy's as soon as possible. Go and tell Malthus that he doesn't have to return to Ansloy's. What he needs to do is to help Natasha take down Emerald Claw Fortress and let the Lion Beast men in. I suspect that our secret can't be kept for much longer. We have to take the initiative," the Dragon Queen said softly as she looked at the dark forest, her eyes reflecting the same gloomy light. "Are we going to do it?" Modesty was slightly surprised. Gwendolen nodded slowly. "But what about those little rats? Don't forget that Mithril is with them. If she returns to Dragon's Valley, we'll be in trouble. I know that they plan on heading to Lone and taking a ship out to sea from there. All you need to do is burn the ship at the port first. After the Moshak captures Asgard, the lizard men will naturally deploy their men to besiege the port. Without naval support, they won't be able to last long." "Me?" Modesty replied timidly. "But what if Eloranta appears?" "She won't appear. As long as we don't personally participate in this war, this is a dispute between the people of Jorgendy Ridge and Cruz. She will neither and has no reason to intervene." "But haven't we already attracted her attention?" Modesty asked cautiously, fearing that it was a trap for her to face the sage who had lived for more than 1,000 years. "She has a motive, but no reason. This is Cruz, not Eloranta. The people of Cruz won't sit back and do nothing. We don't even need to do anything. The Holy Cathedral of Fire will naturally protest. We still have Her Majesty the Little Queen. She has her own ways to deal with this sage. Even a high and mighty sage has to abide by the rules of mortals and can't act recklessly." "Of course," Gwendolen replied calmly. "That's only if we make our move. After that, the barrier between mortals and gods would lose its meaning, which is why you have to make the best use of your time." Modesty's expression was a little ugly, and she replied reluctantly, "Then should I go to Malthus first, or to Lone first?" "You go to Malthus first and ask him to lend you the dragon army." Modesty was slightly taken aback before she understood what the other party was thinking. They couldn't do it themselves, so the dragon beasts were the best substitute. "Humph, cunning fellow," the female dragon muttered to herself. So, in the open area south of the Silver Gushing Valley, the hills began to level out, but along the northern edge of the Rokisi Highlands, there were still undulating hills and large forests. At this moment, Erwin's envoy group was hiding in such a forest. After nearly a day of fleeing, everyone was exhausted and had to stop for a while to enjoy a rare respite and dinner. But there was no need to think about starting a fire. At this moment, the plains in the north were occupied by the lizard men, and any carelessness would lead to the encirclement of the army. In the middle of a simple campsite, in fact, it was just a clearing in the forest, a large group of people surrounded a little girl as if they were watching a rare creature. The latter looked at the human man in front of her in fear, not understanding how he knew so much. She had only said one sentence. At this moment, she heard the man say, "You are Agatha's daughter, right? Is your name Phoenix or Murin?" "Mulan is my elder sister." The little elf replied softly. "So you are Phoenix." The elf's cheeks puffed up. Brando snorted softly, thinking to himself, "You really exposed yourself, you naughty brat, still want to fight with me." In fact, he had returned to the envoy group a few hours ago. Along the way, he had been trying to determine the identity of the little elf Loli, but she would not tell the truth no matter what. She was a perfect example of a naughty brat. If he was a little nicer to her, she would start to talk nonsense, as if lying was free. And if he was a little more fierce to her, she would immediately tear up and be scared speechless. In the end, he had no choice but to patiently use one name after another to test the little Loli. Anyway, he had been to Fanzin before and was familiar with the 10 Cities area and Grey Hues. The wild elves on the east coast of the Emerald Sea had a very close relationship with humans. There were even many wild elves who left their tribe to become mercenaries in White City and Ten Arm Port. Therefore, some of the situations in Iranta were not a secret in Fanzin, and he was quite familiar with the high officials and dignitaries among the wild elves. In the end, when he said Frederica, the captain of the guard of the wild elves' great elder Agatha, the little Loli finally exposed herself because he used the name Martina. The little Loli quickly refuted him, "Mother's captain of the guard is not called Martina." With that one sentence, she had completely sold herself out. And so, there was the previous scene. Now Brando finally figured out who this little girl was. She was the daughter of the wild elves' great elder Agatha, Phoenix. When he analyzed this point, he couldn't help but be stunned. He realized that it wasn't the first time he had seen this little Loli. This naughty Loli was very famous in the history of the future Woned. About 60 years later, in the history of the Year of the Wolf, she went to the White Plains as a representative of Iranta and became the one who issued the mission to kill Akis. In the entire Amber Sword, there were very few players who had experienced the first era who didn't know her. However, he couldn't help but look at this little Loli a few more times. No matter how he looked at it, he couldn't connect this little brat with the gentle and noble elf girl from history. The difference was too great. "Little Loli, how did your life go astray?" He patted the little elf on the shoulder and asked, "How old are you this year?" 62 years old. The little elf had not yet turned from a Loli to a maiden, so she could not be considered a lady. Therefore, her age was not a secret to her. She straightened her back and replied loudly, as if she was not replying to her age, but to something important and sacred. She added, "I'm already very old." Elves reached adulthood at 120 years old, 62 years old. This was the rhythm of a naughty brat. In human age, she was even younger than Chiara. No wonder she was so naughty. Brando couldn't help but think that great elder Agatha was too irresponsible. How could she run away? And the key point was that wild elves were naturally curious. Of course, Flora was an exception. So, they often integrated into human society to satisfy their curiosity. But generally, wild elves, even adult elves, would at most be active around White City. This naughty brat ran to cruise in one breath. There was a distance of thousands of miles between them. How did she run? Thinking of this, he couldn't help but ask curiously, "How did you get here?" The little elf didn't answer. She just glanced at the sky. Brando immediately thought of something. It was the wild elves' floating cloud path. It was a bit like the door of flame in the Holy Cathedral of Fire, but in a different way. The floating cloud path was a real divine artifact. It could send people to other places through the passages above the clouds that were left by the servants of God since ancient times. This divine artifact had several fixed transmission points above Wonde, including the loop of trade winds in the south of Tonajol. But if he remembered correctly, this divine artifact had no coordinates in Cruz. He couldn't help but look at the little elf. The little elf felt uncomfortable under his stare. She replied, "It's all because of Shinni. She said she saw 3 dragons fighting. She dragged me over and we were shot down. You were the one who wanted to see it. I just reminded you to be careful not to bump into them." The dragon lady lying on top of her head screamed angrily, "Little elf, if you continue to shirk responsibility, I'll ignore you." The little elf pouted and stopped talking unhappily. Brando knew who the real culprit was at a glance. But forget it. Now was not the time to pursue the matter. After knowing the identity of the little loli, he was finally relieved. Iquosa was one of the 3 elders of the wild elves and the closest person to Alaranta. The origin of the little loli's emblem of nature affinity seemed to be very reliable. With her around, at least the dragon queen Gwendolyn and Modesty would not act rashly. Of course, this was not what he was most worried about. He was most worried that the unreliable little loli's identity would cause new trouble for them. Ancloys was now a mess. There were the Wind Elves in the north, the Lion Men in Toquinin in the south, the Georgandi Ridge people and the Temple of Earth, plus the 3 dragons. If the Temple of Nature was also involved, this place would be a complete powder keg. Although it was not a bad idea to put a powder keg in the Empire, the problem was that Erwin was right next to it. Not to mention that he was still here, and Brando did not have the habit of blowing himself up. "So, Miss Phoenix, how do you plan to go back now?" Brando thought of another problem. The floating cloud path seemed to be a one-way teleportation. The little elf really did sneak out on her own. He thought that the little loli would be flustered for a while, but she replied with dissatisfaction, "I'm not going back. Mommy is so naughty. I have to send you to class. I want to be the best nightingale in the world. I don't want to go to class." This answer made Brendel realize that it was indeed impossible to communicate with naughty children. But since even the little elf herself didn't care, then he naturally didn't have to worry. In fact, Brendel actually hoped that the little loli would stay. He obviously knew why the dragon queen Gwendolyn had retreated. The little loli staying in the team was like a protective talisman in human form. As long as she was around, the 3 dragons would definitely not appear easily. After confirming the elf's identity, the crowd naturally dispersed. Most of these people were Brendel's own people. After all, he didn't want to reveal Phoenix's true identity for the time being to avoid trouble. However, Chiara and Romaine had more or less guessed the elf's identity when they were in the beehive. As for the former, Brendel wasn't worried. Chiara may be young, but she was unusually mature. On the other hand, Romaine was muddle-headed. Brendel was really worried that she would say something wrong. He reminded her again and again until she glared at him with dissatisfaction. Only then did he understand that this merchant lady also knew the importance of the matter. After sending the others away, there were only a few people left in the clearing. Among them was the representative of House Cipher, Lady Chiara, who was yawning out of boredom, and the merchant lady who was quietly exchanging experiences with the little elf. As for what experiences they were exchanging, there was no doubt that it was the experience between naughty children. The remaining people were the Shire, who looked serious on the surface, and the female mercenary commander, Yura, who looked very tired. For the entire day, they had to rely on this lady's command. Although Maynard and Medisha also contributed a lot, Yura was still the captain of the diplomatic team's guards. She had contributed the most, and now she looked like she was going to fall asleep if she closed her eyes. Apart from these people who had escaped with Brando and met the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn, there were also Princess Magadol, Dilfari, and other members of the diplomatic team. For example, the Mountain of Flesh, the son of Duke Karsuk, the Duke's daughter, Eugenie, Judy, Eiko, and Marjorie, a sergeant from Yanalasu. Lastly, there was Lady Mithril from the Dragon Clan. Among these people, only Kiara and Roman could vaguely guess what Brando was going to say next. The Shire was here as Brando's aide and confidant, although in Tonajol, this position was usually held by Amandina. As for Yuri, she was the captain of the diplomatic team's guards, and Brando could not avoid her. As for the remaining two, as a dragon, Brando did not have to worry about her being surprised by these mortal affairs. Since it involved the internal affairs of the Dragon Clan, he had to ask her to stay and participate in this secret meeting. In fact, Brando was very clear that even if he did not invite Mithril, as long as she wanted to, there was no one in this forest that could not be heard by her. As for the other Erewhon members of the diplomatic team, Brando's feelings towards them were very complicated. As nobles, they were the closest to the crew's nobles, and he did need their help to pacify the crew's nobles who were in the midst of war. But on the other hand, he was a little worried that what he was going to say next would frighten these people and cause them to do something out of line. Regarding this point, he decided to let these people stay after much consideration. Firstly, he felt that Eugenie's words were not without reason, and he should try to trust these people. Secondly, the war between the crew's nobles had nothing to do with the Erewhon nobles, and perhaps what he was going to say would not affect them as much as he thought. Lastly, at this moment, the Erewhon nobles had to stand together. In addition to the people mentioned above, Brando also specifically asked Princess Magadol to stay. Brando also asked the nun princess to stay because of special considerations. This consideration was mostly due to the princess's special identity, because he did not know how reliable Kiara's analysis was, and if it was true, what attitude would the Holy Cathedral of Fire have if it was true? Princess Magadol was undoubtedly the closest and most familiar with the Holy Cathedral of Fire in the diplomatic team. After everyone left, the forest returned to silence. Brando's gaze swept across the faces of everyone present, and those who stayed more or less understood that the Count had something important to say to them, because most of the people present, except for Mithril, could see that there was something mysterious about the people who stayed behind. Except for Princess Magadol and the little elf, there was no crew's nobles present. From this, it was obvious that what he was going to say next was closely related to the war between the crew's nobles, and even more important. But the members of the Erewhon diplomatic team felt a little strange, because in theory, the Count rarely discussed these secrets with them, and he had a group of trusted people. At this time, Brando coughed softly. Chapter 960. Brando coughed softly. Seriously speaking, he really did not know how to start this topic. Should he just tell these people that the Empire's supreme ruler had betrayed the Empire and led the wolf into the house? But what was she after? A person always needed a motive to do something. If he said that the Silver Queen had led Jorgendi Ridge and Toquinen to invade the Empire just to purge the country of dissidents, even he himself would not believe it. How politically naive and childish would she have to be to do such a thing? Unless the Silver Queen tolerated the loss of a large part of the Empire forever in exchange for the stability of her throne. This idea sounded very tempting to some lunatics, but in fact, it was ridiculous because it meant that she had to keep the whole thing a secret forever. Otherwise, her throne would be like a castle in the air. More importantly, whether it was the Jorgendi Ridge or the Lion Men, they could use this to threaten her. With the Silver Queen's character, she would never make such a choice. No matter how crazy the Queen was, it was undeniable that she was the emperor of a huge empire who had reigned for decades. No one dared to treat her as a fool. Brando thought about it and felt that there was only one possibility for what Chiara said to happen. Her Majesty the Queen had supreme power in Georgandy Ridge and the Toquenin Lion Men, so of course, she could use her own forces to protect the king. But this idea sounded like a fantasy. Brando thought for a while and finally said, Chiara, I still have to confirm. Why do you think it's her? Other than Chiara and the Roman, almost everyone else did not know who the so-called her Brando was talking about was. Chiara snorted confidently and said, Isn't that simple? I've told you everything I need to say. About what that stupid dwarf did, anyone with a little intelligence would understand. There are only a few people in the Empire who can do this. Who are they? The supreme ruler of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, the Prime Minister, the Dukes, and that woman. That's all. There seemed to be a cold wind passing through the forest, like a ghost hovering above the canopy, making a whistling sound. Chiara paused for a moment before continuing. But I've already ruled out the first few possibilities. I don't think the Prime Minister would expose his own daughter's shortcomings. First of all, there's no need for him to make such a stupid move. Even if we think about it from another perspective and assume that the Prime Minister did this to clear his name, what's the point of him doing so? Letting the suspicion fall on that woman. It's not necessary because it's too ridiculous. No one would believe it, just like you don't want to believe it now. Brendel nodded. That was true. Chiara smiled contemptuously and said, This is the inherent rigid thinking of you humans. They will think, how could she betray them? Why would she betray herself? How ridiculous. Most people will not think about this. The Empire is hers, but it's also not hers. What do you mean by, you humans? Brando could not help but roll his eyes. This little girl was good at everything, but sometimes she was too arrogant. She was exactly the same as those Bugas. It was a pity that she did not become a wizard. But even so, he still had to play the role of the stupid human. Otherwise, the Honorable Miss Chiara would be embarrassed. So, Honorable Miss Chiara, what do you think? Chiara was very satisfied. She squinted her eyes. Suddenly, she felt that this guy was not so annoying. She showed her sharp canine teeth and said, You just need to think of another situation. Under normal circumstances, the truth we know is very difficult to happen. That is to say, whether it's the supreme ruler of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, the Prime Minister of the Empire, or that woman, most people would not easily suspect them. They would not even have similar associations. The traitor of the Empire could not be the three of them. So for them, not doing anything is the best cover, assuming they are really traitors. But they did. Does this mean that the traitor is actually one of the Grand Dukes? Chiara shook her head. Maybe it is. Before we met Miss Mithril, the gap between dragons and mortals was like the gap between mortals and ants. I know that those Grand Dukes have no connection with the dragons. On the contrary, in the Cruz Empire, I know someone who has a deep relationship with the dragons. Everyone's eyes subconsciously fell on Mithril, the dragon lady who was present. Mithril smiled awkwardly, indicating that it was indeed the case. However, no one knew whether she agreed with the first half of the sentence or the second half. Maybe you are right, but what you said is also applicable to her, Brando said at this time. According to Chiara's words, Her Majesty the Queen was the least suspicious because everyone's first suspicion would not be pointed at her. So, there was no need for her to cover up, right? In fact, Brando had a faint feeling that the truth was very likely to be as Chiara said, especially when she mentioned the relationship between the woman and the dragons. This was an irrefutable reason. Chiara shook her head. She is not trying to distract us, but to find an excuse. Does she really expect the Georgandy gang and the Lion clan to fight their way to the imperial capital Rushta? You and I both know that that is impossible. After all, the Empire is the Empire. Even if it is 1 against 3, it will not be defeated. Everything here is just a cover. Or rather, it's just a curtain being pulled open. Her Majesty's real move must be in the imperial capital. First, she had to deal with the old Prime Minister's forces, then the Holy Cathedral of Fire, or both. But her enemies were too strong, so she had to make them careless first. Most people wouldn't be able to guess this. Even if I didn't know the details of this plot, I wouldn't have thought that she would dare to do this, right? The White Legion is heading to the Evergreen Corridor from the Violet Valley, the Red Legion is fighting against the Wind Elves, and the Black Legion is far away in the north in Ludwig. There is only the Azure Legion near the imperial capital. The Azure Legion is not under the direct command of Her Majesty, so the nobles can let down their guard. But the question is, where is their commander Veronica now? Chiara asked softly. Her voice was like a curse, lingering in everyone's ears. Charles seemed to only react after a long time. He asked leisurely, "This. If I didn't hear wrongly, the two of you seem to be discussing Her Majesty the Queen of the Empire. Are you saying that the so-called traitor of the Empire that Rogers and the others are talking about is Her Majesty the Queen herself?" As soon as he said that, Mithril frowned slightly, but the Duke's daughter Oni and Princess Magadal had an expression of disbelief on their faces. "How is this possible?" Eugenie said subconsciously. She wanted to say that it was impossible, but considering Brando's previous actions, it seemed that he had never done anything without a goal in mind, which affected her judgment. But even so, it was impossible for her to believe that the Silver Queen would betray the Empire. She thought carefully about the question and answer between Chiara and Brando, and realized that they were explaining the reason behind it to her. But so what? She still found it hard to believe. The key was, what benefits could Her Majesty the Queen gain from this? Could it be that she could obtain even more supreme power than she had now? She wanted to completely destroy the Holy Cathedral of Fire and let the Kurlutz people's millennia-long struggle for religious power go up in smoke. This sounded like digging her own grave. Not to mention the backlash from the Holy Cathedral of Fire itself, the other three holy cathedrals would not sit idly by. So other than this reason, what else could motivate her to do such a crazy thing? That's right, crazy, this was the only word that could describe Her Majesty's behavior at this moment. If what Brando and Chiara said was true. At this moment, the Duke's daughter fell into the same confusion as Brando. The source of this confusion was that although they found clues that Her Majesty the Queen might have done this, the problem was that they could not figure out her motive. The only explanation now was that Her Majesty the Queen was completely crazy. But this explanation was obviously not satisfactory. As for Eichel and Princess Magadal, they only frowned slightly. The former had a kind of blind trust in Brando. If Brando said that Her Majesty the Queen betrayed the Empire, then Her Majesty the Queen must have betrayed the Empire. He only had to think about why she betrayed the Empire. Princess Magadal pursed her lips and did not say a word. But it was obvious that she was willing to believe in Brando, but she also found it hard to accept the fact for the time being. She was silent for a while before asking, "Is the Holy Cathedral of Fire in danger now?" "I don't know about this." Chiara spread out her hands and replied, "I can only guess that Her Majesty the Queen would do this. As for the result of her doing this, it could be that her conspiracy succeeded, or it could be that she dug her own grave. But foreseeing all of this is the job of an astrologer." She added bitterly, "Although they have never predicted accurately, and will always give you an ambiguous answer." It was easy to imagine that some astrologer might have offended this young lady at some point in time because of her unwillingness to accept the situation. After asking this question, Princess Magadal fell silent again. Out of everyone, only the officer from Yanalasu opened his mouth and asked, "Everyone, if what the Count said is true, what should we do now?" He saw Brando looking at him and hurriedly bowed before continuing, "After this period of interaction, everyone should have established a certain understanding of each other. I believe that the Count has no reason to lie to us about this matter. We all know the Count's character. Furthermore, this is only a guess, and even if it is a guess, there is still a possibility of it happening. So, what I mean is, if the situation really develops as expected, how should we deal with it? Brando looked at the officer in surprise. He did not understand why the officer would suddenly speak up for him. In fact, this was not a good thing, but he was already used to the traditional nobles of Erewhon standing against him. For a moment, he was not used to having someone on his side. But for this question, he already had an answer in his heart. He gathered these people here to let them know what to do, so that they would not panic when the time comes. He could not believe that Cruz was in the situation. Now, he could only trust these nobles that he brought out from Erewhon. This was a fact that he could not help but feel helpless about. He thought for a moment and replied, "The answer to this question is actually very simple. First, we have to confirm our identity. We are the ambassadors of Erewhon." It would have been better if Brando did not say so. Once he said so, everyone's faces immediately showed different expressions. Except for a few who snickered, most of them looked a little strange. Most of them were thinking that the Count still remembered their identity. Well, they were the ambassadors. But the problem was, what they did along the way was not what the ambassadors were supposed to do. Those who did not know would think that the people from Erewhon were a group of bandits. They burned, killed, and looted along the way, although they were targeting the nobles. Of course, they did not dare to say this out loud. The Count had always been arbitrary. According to him, they were teaching the Empire a lesson for the glory of the kingdom, although it seemed like they were taking the opportunity to vent their anger. But at least there was one thing that everyone was convinced of. That was, as Brando said, the Empire did not seem to have the time to teach them a lesson. And now, it seemed that not only would they not teach them a lesson, but they would also become the Empire's heroes, if Her Majesty did not go crazy. The others did not agree with him and kept nodding. Only the Duke's daughter, Eugenie, did not have this habit. She asked, "Count, what you mean is that the war with Cruz has nothing to do with us?" That is to say, for now, we have two choices. Either we continue to move forward, or we choose to retreat and return to Erewhon. I'm afraid we can't retreat, the Shire shook his head. Behind us are the people of Georgandy Ridge. We had a hard time breaking out, how can we go back? So the only way left is to move forward. Roman asked. More or less. Brando nodded. But there are some changes to the plan. Our previous idea of trapping Lone seems unrealistic now. After all, the other party has 3 dragons. With them around, no matter how high the city walls are, they will be ashes under the flames. We have to find a way to leave Lone by boat and head to Metz or Cloak Bay. He glanced at the dragon lady and continued, "Our top priority now is to leave this troublesome place and send Madame Mithril out to inform the dragons. As for the rest, it's not something we can control." But how can they let us go so easily? Those are 3 dragons, Eugenie questioned. She looked at Mithril and asked boldly, "Madame Mithril, may I ask if you can still fight in your current state?" Mithril shook her head. "I'm afraid it'll be difficult, young lady. We don't have to face the Dragon Queen directly. The sprites have nature affinity emblems on them, so they won't dare to act rashly. But I guess they will go to Lone Harbor to burn the ships ahead of us. This is a trick the dragons often play." Brando had already considered this question and answered confidently. "Burning the ships. That's even worse. If the dragons really burn the ships in the harbor, won't we be trapped in Lone?" Fatty Ephraim couldn't help but ask with a frown when he heard the news. "Can we reach Azaf first?" Marjorie asked further. Brando shook his head. The north was already filled with troops in Georgandy Ridge. It was obvious that the Cruz Empire was retreating, and to break through the heavy encirclement and reach Azaf before the Lizard King was something that could only be imagined in his dreams. He replied, "Don't worry, the Dragon Queen won't be able to burn all the ships. As long as we reach Lone, we will have a chance. So now we have to think about how to reach Lone." Everyone looked at the Count strangely, not understanding where his confidence came from. But now they had gradually developed a habit. Since Brandos said that the Dragon Queen couldn't burn the ships, they would treat it as if she couldn't. Eugenie said, "Since the Count said that the Dragon Queen won't appear in person, then they will definitely send the Georgandy Ridge people to intercept us. What we need to be careful of are the Georgandy Ridge patrols." "I don't think it's difficult," Marjorie said after some consideration. "The Georgandy Ridge people's primary goal is definitely Fort Asaf. It's impossible for them to mobilize too many people to find us. We just need to follow the pre-planned route along the northern edge of the Rokisi Highlands, where Georgandy Ridge's forces are the thinnest. There shouldn't be too much trouble. And according to the information collected by Rogers, Lone Harbor shouldn't have fallen into the hands of Georgandy Ridge. After leaving the harbor, which route do we take? Metz or Cloak Bay?" Dilfery spoke for the first time. "P.S. It's a little late today. You're tuning in to the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.